A boy of about 10 offers the stranger half a mug of water, the last of the water in the dying village. But the stranger, his head split open, refuses and asks instead to be shown where the bed of the dead river used to be. In a day's time, the whole village will be standing over a pit of clear, cold water, weeping. It's just that he knew how to read the land, and they didn't. Daniel opens his eyes and sees a white, empty sky. His head is splitting so badly that for a second he thinks he's still alive and lying on the side of the road outside Ashgabat. But it's not asphalt beneath his back. It's dry, hot earth. Nearby stands a warped wooden well house. The rope has rotted and hangs like a brown rag. His mouth tastes of dust and blood. He touches the back of his head. His fingers get wet. The fresh wound throbs with every heartbeat. Daniel sits up. The world is spinning. All around are low houses made of clay bricks, thatched roofs. Skinny chickens peck at invisible grain. It reeks of dust, manure, and something sour. He looks at himself. Field pants, work boots. His shirt is torn, but the WaterAid patch still hangs on the sleeve. And this is where the strangeness begins. Instead of asking where he is, his gaze creeps across the ground on its own. 15 years in the field have taken their toll. His eyes read the terrain before his brain has time to ask a question. Red laterite soil, not a trace of mulch. The furrows in the field run across the slope. Across. That means every rain washes the fertile layer downhill. And the well. The well stands right at the very top of the hill. Who would put a well where the water can't go anywhere? Daniel stands up. His legs are wobbly, but they hold him up. 3 steps. He stares intently at the horizon. The wind is blowing from the southwest. In the distance, a wide, dry riverbed. A river once flowed here. The banks have eroded and are overgrown with dead, brown shrubs. The slope looks to be about 2%. On the right side, the ground is slightly darker, barely noticeable. But Daniel notices it. Darker means wetter. That means there's still water down below. And then the boy says something. Daniel doesn't know the language, but the words sink into his mind as if they'd always been there. The boy says that his uncle isn't feeling well and that there's almost no water, but he'll bring half a mug. Daniel looks at the child's lips, chapped until they bleed, at his sunken cheeks, at his thin neck, and he wheezes that he doesn't need water. He'd rather the boy show him where the low-lying area is and where the riverbed used to be. The boy blinks. He turns and dashes toward the houses, shouting something as he runs. 10 minutes later, about 15 people are standing by the well. Women, old people, men with faces darkened by the sun. Everyone is silent and watching. The stranger doesn't look like them. His clothes are different. His boots are made of an unfamiliar material. And he looks at their land like a man who's calculating something. A stooped man in his 50s steps forward, his face as if sculpted from the same clay as the houses. The village elder, Merrick. He asks who he is and where he's from. Daniel thinks for a second. The truth is useless. He says he's come from far away, that he was robbed on the road and hit on the head, that he's a builder. Merrick asks what he builds. Daniel utters a single word. Water. The silence hangs so thick you can hear a chicken scratching with its foot. Merrick stares for a long time. Then he lists the facts in a flat, lifeless voice. The well ran dry 2 months ago. The Dry Ford River hasn't flowed for 4 years. The children are sick. 3 families left for the south, and there's been no word from them. Baron Halden Morway promised prayerful assistance in exchange for raising the tax from 1/6 to 1/3 of the harvest, which there isn't. He says this like a man who long ago stopped hoping and is simply listing the facts before he dies. Daniel knows how to listen. 15 years of working in communities where people don't believe you at first have taught him one thing: don't argue, don't promise, show them. He asks for one worker and a shovel for half a day. If he's wrong, he'll leave quietly in the morning. If not, they'll have a talk. Merrick looks at him as if he were sick. Then he nods and calls over a young man, Tobias, a broad-shouldered, sullen 25-year-old with hands that could bend horseshoes if there were horses in the village. He looks at Daniel without a shred of respect, but he takes the shovel because they promised him dinner. Daniel leads him north, past the dead vegetable garden, past the pen where a single goat stares with indifferent yellow eyes, 400 meters to the rocky slope that everyone avoids. Useless land. That's what everyone thinks. Daniel stops. He walks 20 steps to the left, 10 to the right. He watches a stunted shrub grow. Not evenly, in patches. In one spot, the greenery is slightly denser and brighter. That means the roots have a source of water. He points his finger at a barely noticeable hollow between two ledges. Dig here, as deep as he is tall, 1 meter by 1 meter. Tobias twirls his finger against his temple, but he digs. The first half meter is a struggle. Rock and dry clay. The shovel clangs. Tobias sweats and curses. At 1 meter, the soil softens. At 1.5 meters, dampness appears. Tobias freezes and looks up. Daniel nods. Keep digging. At 2 meters, the clay turns dark and damp. The shovel sinks in with a soft squelch. Tobias lifts it. Water glistens on the blade, dirty and murky, but water nonetheless. He stands in the hole and says nothing. By evening, the hole is 2.5 meters deep. At the bottom, there are 40 centimeters of clear, cold water. It seeps from the walls, slowly and stubbornly. Tobias climbs out, caked in clay from head to toe. He looks down. He says nothing. Daniel says calmly that there's an aquifer under the hill, that the shrubs grew in patches because their roots reached the water, that nobody had simply looked. Tobias opens his mouth. He closes it. He turns around and practically runs toward the village. An hour later, the whole village is gathered around the pit. From the little kids to old Gwen, who hadn't been able to walk for 2 months and was brought there supported by others. People look down at the water. Someone is crying. One woman falls to her knees and prays. Merrick stares at Daniel for a long time and quietly asks how he knew. Daniel shrugs. It's his job. And then, from the back rows, a man in long, dark robes steps forward. Tall and thin, with a face as sharp as a blade. Father Garrett, the priest. He looks at the pit, then at the stranger, and thunders so that everyone can hear. This water is not from God. The stranger has come from who knows where and is digging the earth without a blessing. The drying up of the sky is a trial sent by the 7 clouds, and whoever deceives the sky will bring disaster upon everyone. The silence grows heavy. People's eyes dart from the priest to the water and back again. Daniel doesn't argue. He looks at Garrett and says just one thing. The children are thirsty. The water is real. Do you want to bless it right now? Garrett clenches his jaw. He remains silent. He turns and walks away. But Daniel sees several people watching the priest leave and then glancing doubtfully at the pit. The seed has been sown, not in the ground, in people. And this seed can be more dangerous than any drought. He spends the night in a barn on straw, a bowl of watery porridge with fewer grains than water. He eats it all, and only one thought runs through his mind, the one that's always there. He's counting. 120 people, at least 2 liters each for drinking, plus cooking, plus livestock, plus irrigation. About 500 liters a day for the village. The well yields maybe 100, a drop in the bucket. We need a canal. We need a catchment basin. We need a system. He closes his eyes and draws a map in his mind. The slopes, the dry riverbed to the east, the aquifer beneath the northern hill. Dig a canal from the water source down the slope toward the village. 400 meters, a 1.5% gradient. Any steeper, and it'll erode. Any gentler, and it'll silt up. At the outlet, a settling basin made of stone and sand in 3 layers. Clean water straight to the center of the settlement. 2 weeks if there are 5 people. Daniel opens his eyes. 5 people. He has one, Tobias, and he's on the payroll. In the morning, he gets up before dawn. He walks to the pit. The water level has risen by 60 centimeters. The filtration is even better than he thought. He tastes the water with his palm. It's clean, cold, and tasteless. The aquifer is fed from somewhere to the north, from those blue mountains on the horizon. If there are glaciers there, the underground stream won't dry up in the summer. That's very good. For 2 hours, he measures distances with his strides and gauges the angles of the slopes with his eyes. When he returns to the shed, 2 people are waiting for him, Tobias and a girl. Tall and thin, with a straight back and a gaze that doesn't ask, but demands. Ella, the village headman's daughter. She says her father sent her to find out what the stranger plans to do, and that if he's a charlatan, he should leave now before people start to hope. Because in this village, hope kills faster than thirst. Daniel picks up a stick from the ground. He crouches down and draws directly on the trampled earth. Here's the hill. Here's the water-filled pit. Here's the village. Here's the bed of the dead river. Dig a canal from here to there, and the water will flow on its own. Down the slope. No sorcery, no prayers. Simply because water always flows downhill. Ella looks at the diagram. Tobias leans forward too. Yesterday's pit had done its job. He still doesn't believe it, but he can't help but listen now. Ella looks up and asks how many people are needed. 5. For 2 weeks. She has 3. With Tobias, that makes 4. She'll be the 5th. Daniel nods, and this morning, on the edge of the dying village of Sequoia Broad, work begins that will change everything. Work began the next morning. Daniel marked out the canal's path with sticks stuck in the ground every 10 steps. 5 people. Himself, Ella, Tobias, 2 twin brothers named Chris and Owen. Quiet guys in their 20s with identical sun-scorched faces. They hadn't come because they believed in Daniel. They'd come because Ella had asked. And in this village, no one ever said no to Ella. Not because they were afraid, because they knew she was the only one still trying. Daniel showed them where to dig. He explained the depth, 0.5 meter, the width, 0.5 meter, and most importantly, the slope, 1.5%. He measured it using a rope and 2 sticks of different lengths, a primitive level. Tobias asked why it had to be so complicated. Daniel said that if the slope were any less, the water would stop, and the channel would get clogged with mud. If it were any steeper, the water would flow too fast and wash away the walls. 1.5% is when the water flows evenly, calmly, and carries itself. Tobias didn't say anything, but he remembered. Daniel could see it in his eyes. The kid was taking it all in. The first 3 days were tough. The soil in the upper section was rocky. The shovels clanged. The calluses on his hands burst and bled. Daniel's whole body ached. He wasn't a laborer. He was an engineer. His hands were used to a pencil and a computer, not a shovel. But he dug alongside everyone else, because he knew the rule. If you don't dig with them, you're the boss. And there were plenty of bosses here. The Baron is the boss. The priest is a boss. Daniel needed to become someone else, someone who works alongside them. On the 4th day, the first mishap occurred. The canal wall collapsed. A chunk of clay the size of a barrel crashed inward and buried 2 days' worth of work. Chris barely managed to jump out of the way. If he'd been standing just one step closer, he would have been buried. By evening, the news had reached Father Garrett. He was standing by the chapel, speaking to the people gathered for evening prayer. He said that the earth was resisting because a stranger was going against the order of things. That the 7 clouds had sent a sign that if they continued, the next collapse wouldn't be on the canal, but on a house or on a child. The 5 people listening to the prayer nodded. 3 of them were Chris's relatives. That morning, Chris and Owen didn't show up for work. Ella found them at home. Chris was sitting on the doorstep, mending a net. Owen was standing nearby. Chris didn't look up and said his mother had forbidden it. She said he'd had enough of angering the gods for the sake of some crazy stranger. Ella stood in front of them and said nothing. Then she turned and walked away. Daniel saw her face when she came back. No anger, no resentment, just exhaustion. The kind that builds up over the years when you're dragging people along who don't want to be dragged. Daniel told her it was normal, that he'd seen it dozens of times, in Kenya, in Uzbekistan, in Chad. It's the same everywhere. The first setback and half of them walk away. It's not cowardice, it's fear that's built up over generations. People are used to the fact that any attempt to change something ends in punishment, whether from nature or from their masters. Ella asked what to do. Daniel said they had to keep going. The 3 of them. Results speak louder than words. The 3 of them dug for 6 days. Daniel, Ella, Tobias. From dawn until noon. Afternoon, the sun became unbearable, and it was impossible to work. Daniel used the afternoon hours for something else. He walked around the village. He looked around. He took stock. He talked. Not about the canal, about something else. He asked the women how much water they used each day for cooking. He asked the elderly when the river had last been full. He asked the children where they'd seen wet ground after the last rain. The children were his best sources of information. They ran around the neighborhood and knew every rock. The boy who found him by the well, his name was Nolan, 10 years old, quick, curious, with eyes that noticed everything. Nolan became his guide. He showed him a ravine south of the village where, after rare rains, puddles lingered longer than anywhere else. He showed him a spot by an old oak tree where the ground was soft, even in the height of the drought. He showed him rocks at the foot of the northern hill that were covered with a greenish film. Moss. Moisture. Each of these details fit into the map Daniel was constructing in his head. On the 10th day, the channel had reached the halfway point, 200 meters. Water from the upper pit began to seep into the channel. Slowly, a thin trickle along the bottom, a bit murky, but it was flowing. Tobias stood in the channel and watched as the water crept past his boots. He said quietly that water really does flow downhill. Daniel smiled and replied that it did. Water always flows down. That's the whole secret. Tobias looked up at him, and for the first time in 10 days, there was something resembling interest on his face. Not belief, not yet, but interest. On the 12th day, the problem Daniel had been expecting, but hoping would come later, arrived. Father Garrett brought 3 men to the canal. They stood at the edge and watched the work. Garrett asked loudly, so that everyone who could hear would know, whether the stranger had received permission from Baron Morway to dig the canal on his land. Daniel stuck his shovel into the ground. He straightened up. He looked at the priest. This was village land, communal land. But Daniel understood that, technically, all the land belonged to the Baron, and that Garrett knew this, and that a trap was being set right now. If the Baron found out about the canal too soon, he'd send people, and it would all be over. Daniel replied calmly. He said that the canal was just a ditch. Peasants have the right to dig ditches for farming. This isn't building a fortress or damming up a river. It's a ditch for watering the vegetable garden. Garrett smirked and said that a half-kilometer-long ditch wasn't for a vegetable garden, and that he would write to the Baron. Daniel looked him in the eye and said that, of course, the priest was free to write to whomever he pleased. But if the Baron came and saw the ditch, he would ask why it was there, and he would find out that the village had found water. And then the Baron would take the water for himself, all of it, because that was his right. Garrett fell silent. He hadn't thought of that. The three men behind him exchanged glances. Daniel saw the thought cross their faces. If the Baron found out about the water would become his, not the village's, his. And instead of 1/6, he'd take it all. Garrett turned and walked away, not because he agreed, because the argument was too strong to dispute in front of witnesses. Daniel knew this wasn't the end. It was just a pause. But the pause was necessary. On the 14th day, the canal reached the village, 420 meters. For the last 20, Daniel dug alone because Tobias and Ella were reinforcing the walls with clay on the upper section. He dug and thought about how, in his past life, a canal like this would have taken 2 days with an excavator. Here, it took 2 weeks with 3 people. But the result was the same. The water was flowing. He extended the canal to a clearing in the center of the village, next to the well. That very same dried-up well where he had woken up. He dug a small settling pond, a pit 2 meters by 2. He lined the bottom with stones, a layer of coarse sand on top, then a layer of fine sand, then a layer of charcoal that a local blacksmith had given him. The simplest of filters. Daniel opened the dam made of packed clay that had been holding the water in the upper part of the canal. The water began to flow. Slowly at first, a thin, murky trickle. Then stronger, even stronger. An hour later, the settling tank began to fill up. The water passed through the filter and came out clean on the other side, clear as glass. Daniel scooped some up in his palm. He tasted it. Clean, fresh, cold. Nolan was the first to see it. The boy had been standing around the corner of the house, watching Daniel for about 10 minutes. When the water started flowing, he bolted from his spot and ran through the village, shouting as he went. 5 minutes later, everyone was standing by the settling tank. Just like 2 weeks ago at the pit on the hill. Only this time, the water wasn't in a pit on the hillside. It was here, in the center of the village. And it was flowing. A woman named Martha, a widow, so thin she was almost transparent. She walked up to the settling tank, dipped her hands into the water, and froze. Daniel saw her shoulders begin to shake. She was crying silently. Her grandson was standing next to her, a boy of about 6. He didn't understand why his grandmother was crying. He just stared at the water. Merrick walked over to Daniel. He stood beside him. He said one word, "Thank you." Daniel shook his head. He said this was only the beginning, that the canal yielded about 200 liters a day. That would be enough for drinking and cooking, but not for irrigation. For irrigation, they'd need a water reservoir, a big one, at least 200 cubic meters. That's a month's worth of work. And they'd need people, not 3, 10. Better yet, 15. Merrick looked at the village, at the people standing around the water, at their faces, at the hands reaching out to scoop it up. Then he looked at Daniel and said the people would come. That evening, Daniel sat by the barn and watched the sunset. His shirt was soaked with sweat. His arms were throbbing. His back wouldn't straighten. Ella came over to him. She sat down beside him, silently. They sat there for a minute. Then she said that 2 years ago, she had a younger sister, Lyra. She was 7. The next morning, 12 people were gathered by Daniel's shed, men and women. Some had come because they'd seen the water, some because Merrick had asked them to, some because their wives had told them to stop sitting around waiting to die. Daniel stood before them, drawing on the ground with a stick. He explained the plan. A water collection basin, a large pit in a natural depression south of the village, right where Nolan had shown him the spot, where puddles formed after it rained. The soil there was dense, clayey. It held water well. Dimensions: 10 meters by 20, 2 meters deep. That's 400 cubic meters if filled to the brim, 200 if filled halfway. 200 cubic meters is enough to irrigate 10 plots for 2 months. Line the walls with 2 layers of clay. Compact the bottom. A supply channel branching off from the main trunk line. A drainage channel leading to the fields on the southeast slope. 3 weeks of work. Maybe 4. 12 people were listening. Some understood, some didn't. Tobias stood slightly to the side and translated Daniel's words into a language they could understand. He said that the stranger wanted to dig a large pit for water and run a pipe to it. Not a pipe, Daniel corrected. A canal. Tobias waved his hand and said, a ditch. Everyone understood. Work began that very day. Daniel divided the people into 3 groups. The first dug the foundation pit for the water collection basin. The second reinforced the walls of the main channel in areas where the clay was crumbling. The third prepared the materials: clay, stones, sand, and branches for the formwork. Ella commanded the third group. Daniel watched her work with the men. Concise, clear, without unnecessary words. When Old Man Burke complained that his back couldn't take it, Ella silently took the heavy bucket from him and gave him a light basket for sand. She didn't humiliate him. She didn't sideline him. She found a place for him. Daniel took note. A good foreman is worth 10 workers. On the 3rd day of digging the foundation pit, what Daniel had foreseen happened. At a depth of 1 meter, they struck a layer of dense clay. Hard as a rock, the shovels bounced off it. Work came to a standstill. People began exchanging glances. Someone said the earth wasn't cooperating. Someone said that Father Garrett was right. Daniel jumped down into the pit. He crouched down. He felt the clay with his hands. Then he took out a knife and poked at it. Dense, dry, but uniform. No rocks. He stood up and said that this was good. Everyone looked at him as if he were crazy. He explained, the dense clay at the bottom is a perfect natural waterproofing layer. Water won't seep downward. The catchment basin will hold water like a pot. There's no need to line the bottom separately. Nature has already done that for them. They just need to break through this layer along the edges where the walls will go and leave the bottom as is. Tobias translated. The men fell silent. Then one of them said, all right, and he thrust his shovel into the clay with such force that a chunk the size of a fist flew off. Work resumed. Daniel noticed that something had changed after that moment. The men began asking questions, not out of suspicion, out of curiosity. Why doesn't the canal run straight but curve slightly? Because it follows the terrain and the natural slope. Why coat the walls with clay instead of leaving them as bare earth? Because soil lets water through, but clay doesn't. Why is the drainage channel narrower than the main one? Because a narrow channel creates pressure and the water flows further. Every answer was simple, logical, clear, and every answer stuck in their minds. Daniel wasn't just building, he was teaching. Not because he wanted to be a teacher, but because he knew one thing. If he left the village where he'd built the system and no one understood how it worked, everything would fall apart within a year. He'd seen it happen in Mali. A beautiful water treatment plant. Western engineers had built it in a month. 6 months later, the pump broke down and no one knew how to fix it. The village went back to the dirty river. He never made that mistake again. On the 5th day, a woman whom Daniel had never seen before came to the construction site. She was short, quiet, with a sack slung over her shoulder, from which bundles of dry grass stuck out. Dark hair, narrow eyes. Her facial features were different from those of the other villagers. She stood at the edge of the excavation and looked down. Then she approached Daniel and asked what he was building. He explained, a water collector. She nodded. Then she asked if he was planning to plant anything in the irrigated plots. Daniel said yes, but he didn't know what crops grew here. She said she knew. Her name was Hana-san, an herbalist, a traveler from the southern provinces, the daughter of a migrant healer. She had come to Sukoi Broad for black wormwood root, which grew only on arid slopes. She asked if she could examine the soil where he planned to lay out his first garden beds. Daniel said, "Of course." They walked to the southeast slope. Hana knelt down. She took a handful of soil. She rubbed it between her fingers. She sniffed it. She tasted it on her tongue. Daniel watched her and recognized the movements. He'd seen agronomists do this in the field, only they used test kits and instruments. Hana used her hands. She said the soil was poor. Nitrogen levels were 0, but there were traces of phosphorus. If they grew legumes in the first cycle, they would return nitrogen to the soil. Then they could plant grains. She named some local plants. Daniel didn't know the names, but he understood the principle. She was describing a classic crop rotation. 3 crops in rotation: legumes for nitrogen, grains for the harvest, grasses to restore soil structure. Daniel said that was exactly what he had planned. Hana looked up at him. For the first time, something other than calm flashed in her eyes. Surprise. She said that no one had ever listened before when she talked about the land. Usually, people told her to pick her own herbs and stay out of men's business. Daniel replied that he didn't know which tasks here were men's work and which weren't. He knew he needed someone who understood the local plants, and that she was that person. Hana was silent for 3 seconds. Then she said that the black wormwood could wait. And so, a 4th key member joined Daniel's team. Ella for the people, Tobias for the work, Nolan for reconnaissance, and Hana for the land. A week later, the excavation was ready. 10 by 20 meters, 2 meters deep. The walls were coated with 2 layers of clay. The bottom was left as is, dense clay, a natural waterproofing agent. The supply channel from the main line was ready. The outlet channel, leading to the first 3 plots on the slope, was half finished. Daniel stood at the edge of the catchment basin and looked down. Empty. Huge. Like a wound in the earth. Everything depended on one thing: rain. Without rain, the catchment basin was useless. The underground spring provided water for drinking and household needs, but irrigation required volume, and only the sky could provide that volume, or what remained of the rain if it was collected properly. Daniel looked up at the sky, white, empty, not a single cloud, just like on the first day. Ella walked over and stood beside him. She was looking up too. Then she said that the rains usually come in 2 months, if they come at all. For the past 4 years, they've been light, 1 or 2 downpours, sometimes 3. All the water seeped into the ground within an hour, leaving nothing behind. Daniel nodded. He knew this problem well. In arid regions, rain is often an enemy, not a friend. It comes all at once, a lot, fast. The water hits the dry, hard ground and rolls right off without being absorbed. It washes away the topsoil. It erodes the furrows, and an hour later, everything is dry again. But a catchment basin solves this problem. It catches the water, it holds it, and it releases it slowly, when needed, as much as needed, where it's needed. Daniel explained to Ella what else needed to be done. A rainwater collection system. Around the catchment basin on the slopes, gutters, channels, and guides, so that every raindrop falling within a 300-meter radius would flow into the catchment basin. Nothing should just seep away into the ground. Every liter counts. Ella listened. Then she asked how many people were needed. Daniel said 5, for a week. Ella said there would be 8. By evening, she'd brought 10. Daniel looked at her and smiled for the first time ever. Ella didn't smile back. She said there was nothing to smile about. There was plenty of work to do. The next 2 weeks were spent on the retention system and terracing the southern slope. Terraces. That was what finally changed people's understanding. Daniel explained it simply. The slope is the field's enemy. Water runs downhill and washes everything away. But if you make steps, each step is a small, level field. Water pools on each step. It soaks in. It nourishes the roots. It doesn't run off. He drew a diagram. He showed how to cut into the earth, how to reinforce the edge of each terrace with stones and clay, how to leave a channel for excess water so that the terrace wouldn't be washed away during heavy rain. The people worked, silently, intently. Daniel watched their movements change. In the early days, they dug mechanically. They just did as they were told. Now they were beginning to understand. Tobias asked why this terrace was wider and that one narrower. Because the slope is different, and the water retention area must be proportional to the volume of runoff. Ella asked why the stones at the edge were laid that way. Because water seeks out weak spots, and if you leave a gap, it will wash away the entire wall in a single downpour. Hana walked along the finished terraces and marked where to plant what. Beans at the bottom, where it's wetter. Sorghum higher up, where it's drier. Grasses at the very top for restoration. Daniel watched this and felt something he rarely felt. Hope. Not his own. Theirs. It was as fragile as a sprout in dry soil. One wrong move and it would break. That's why he took his time. He didn't make promises. He just did the work. On the 20th day since construction of the catchment basin began, an event occurred that Daniel could not control. Father Garrett came to see him. Alone, without an entourage, in the evening. Daniel was sitting by the shed, repairing a shovel. Garrett stood opposite him, silently. Then he sat down on a rock. A month had passed since Daniel opened his eyes by the dried-up well. Dry Ford had changed. Not drastically, not beyond recognition, but people with a keen eye could see the difference. A narrow strip of damp earth stretched along the canal from the northern hill to the center of the village. Near the settling pond, grass had pushed through the trampled earth. Green, short, but green. The women no longer had to walk 2 kilometers to the distant stream, which flowed like a thread and dried up every other day. The water was here, in the center, every day. Not much, but every day. Daniel stood at the edge of the catchment basin and looked up at the sky. White. Empty, as always. 2 months until the rainy season. If the rains come. Hana stood nearby and talked about sorghum, a local variety, drought-resistant, short stalks, small grains but high in calories. She said that if they planted it now on the lower terraces and watered it from the canal, by the rainy season the roots would have grown deep enough, and then even a light rain would give them a boost. Daniel listened and nodded. Hana knew the land. He knew the water. Together, they could grow something. He asked her about legumes. She named 3 local varieties. One of them fixed nitrogen in the soil like clover. Small pods. Bitter. People didn't like them. But they brought the land back to life. Daniel said they would plant the legumes on the upper terraces. Not for food. For the soil. The first harvest would be sorghum from the lower terraces. Hana nodded. Then she said quietly that in her home village in the south, her father had said the same thing. That first you have to feed the land, and then the land will feed you. They didn't listen to him. She paused. Then she added that that was why she had left. Daniel didn't ask for details. Not now. Planting began that very day. Hana was in charge. She showed the women how to plant the sorghum. The depth of the seed, the distance between the holes, and the direction of the rows. Daniel oversaw the watering. He calculated how much water to give each plot. 6 liters per square meter per day. No more. Water is expensive. Every liter counts. He built a very simple system. Water flowed from the canal into a distributor, a clay trough with 5 holes. Each hole led to its own row on the terrace, plugs made of rags and clay. Open one, water the row. Close it, open the next one. Primitive, but it worked. Tobias looked at the system and shook his head. He said it was like watering a cow through a straw. Daniel replied that that was exactly what it was, and that it only made the cow healthier. Tobias snorted. But that evening, Daniel saw Tobias sitting by the distributor, opening and closing the plugs, checking, counting, learning. On the 5th day after the sowing, something happened that divided the village once again. A knight, alone, on horseback, in light chainmail, with a sword at his belt. Not from the Baron's retinue. A traveler. He was heading south through Sukhoi Brod. Nothing out of the ordinary. An old road ran through the village. The knight stopped by the well. He saw water in the settling tank. He saw the canal. He dismounted. He walked around. He looked. He asked questions of Old Man Burke, who was sitting nearby mending a basket. Burke told him everything about the stranger, the canal, the catchment basin, and the terraces. The knight listened. He mounted his horse and rode south. Daniel didn't find out about this until that evening from Nolan. The boy told him everything and described the knight. He described the coat of arms on his shoulder. Daniel didn't know much about heraldry, but Ella did. She turned pale. She said the coat of arms belonged to House Morway. This was one of the Baron's men, not just a passerby, a scout. The Baron had sent them throughout the province to gather intelligence. And now he would find out about the water at Dry Ford. Daniel sat down and thought. Then he said it was inevitable. Sooner or later, the Baron would have found out. The question was what he would do. Ella said there were 2 options. Either he'd raise taxes or he'd take the water. He'd claim the right of first water and station his steward at the canal. Daniel asked what the right of first water was. Ella explained. An ancient law. A feudal lord has the right to the first share of any water source on his lands. Exactly how much that first share isn't defined. Maybe a quarter, maybe all of it. It depends on the lord. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he said that meant they needed to build faster. The more infrastructure there was when the Baron sent his men, the harder it would be to take it all away. A canal can be shut off, but if there are 5 canals feeding 10 plots and a family works on each plot, shutting one off means starving 30 people. And that's no longer just one outsider's problem. It's the village's problem. Ella looked at him. Then she said, he was thinking like a lord. Daniel shook his head and replied that he was thinking like an engineer. An engineer builds a system that's hard to break. For the next 3 weeks, Daniel worked at triple the usual pace. The second canal, from the catchment basin to the eastern plots. The third canal, a bypass, in case the main one gets clogged or damaged. A backup system. He explained to Tobias why a backup canal was necessary. Tobias asked what backup meant. Daniel said it was a spare, just in case the first one broke. Tobias said it was like having a second axe in the house. Daniel replied that was exactly right. Tobias nodded. He got it. Hannah was working on the terraces. The sorghum had sprouted, tiny green shoots, 2 centimeters above the ground, as thin as hairs, but green. When the first sprouts appeared from the soil on the lower terrace, Nolan ran up to Daniel and tugged at his hand. He dragged him over to the garden bed. He pointed. Look, green! It's growing! Daniel crouched down and looked. 2 centimeters of life in the dry soil. He reached out and gently touched the sprout. Warm. Alive. Nolan stood nearby, beaming. He asked if it was true that this would turn into food. Daniel said yes, in 3 months if everything went well. Nolan asked, what if it doesn't go well? Daniel said that then they'd try again. Nolan thought for a moment and said that was a good plan. Daniel smiled. A 10-year-old boy had summed up his strategy in 2 words better than any reviewer at a conference. Another week passed. The sprouts had grown to 10 centimeters. Hana said the roots had already gone deep. That's a good sign. The watering is working. The distribution system is holding up. People were watering according to the schedule Daniel had drawn up and posted on the wall of the community center. Morning and evening. 6 liters per square meter per day. No more. He explained that overwatering is just as dangerous as drought. The roots rot, the sun bakes the wet earth, and it cracks like pottery. Just enough. Chris and Owen returned, silently. They arrived in the morning. They grabbed shovels. They lined up. Ella looked at them. They didn't look at her. They were ashamed. Ella said nothing. She pointed to the plot. They began to dig. Daniel watched from around the corner of the shed and thought that Ella would become a great leader if she survived. She didn't humiliate those who had left. She simply made room for them when they returned. That's a rare gift. Toward the end of the 2nd month, Daniel began working on something that required a blacksmith, an Archimedes screw. A very simple mechanism for lifting water. A spiral chute inside a cylinder. You turn the handle. The water rises. Not very high, a meter, maybe 1.5 meters, but that's enough to lift the water from the canal to the upper terrace, where it wouldn't reach by gravity alone. Daniel drew a sketch on a piece of bark with a charcoal stick. He brought it to the village blacksmith's shop. The blacksmith, Master Pak, short, broad-shouldered, with hands like pincers, graying temples, a man of few words. He looked at the sketch, turned the piece of bark over, looked again, said he didn't understand half the symbols. Daniel began to explain. Master Pak listened. He frowned. Then a girl emerged from behind the curtain at the back of the smithy. Young, about 16, short, sturdy, with soot on her cheek and a burn on her left arm. Dark hair, narrow eyes like Hana's, the same Korean blood. Master Pak's daughter, Sora. She silently took the bark from her father's hands. She looked at the drawing. She ran her finger along the lines. Then she looked up at Daniel and said that the spiral didn't have to be made from a single piece. It could be made from 3 segments, joined with rivets, easier to bend. It's easier to repair if it breaks. Daniel froze. He looked at the blueprint. He looked at Sora. She was right. 3 segments are easier to manufacture and maintain than a single-piece spiral. He'd been working with this mechanism for 10 years and had used the single-piece design because that's how it was in the textbooks. And a 16-year-old girl had come up with a better solution in 30 seconds. Master Pak stood nearby, silent. There was a strange expression on his face. Not surprise. Familiarity. He knew that his daughter saw blueprints the way others saw faces, at a glance. But that was useless knowledge in a world where a girl had no place in a blacksmith shop. Daniel looked at Sora and said she needed to be on the construction site, not in the blacksmith shop. On the construction site. He said he needed someone who could read blueprints and turn them into things. Master Pak began to say that his daughter couldn't do it. Sora cut her father off. She said one word, I can. Master Pak fell silent. Daniel could see 2 emotions battling in his eyes, fear for his daughter and the realization that she had long outgrown the blacksmith shop where they wouldn't let her work. Master Pak turned away toward the anvil and muttered that she could do whatever she wanted. Sora took the bark scroll with the blueprint and left. At the threshold, she turned and looked at her father. He didn't turn around. But Daniel saw his hands clench on the anvil. 3 days later, Sora brought the finished screw, made of 3 segments held together by rivets, housed in a wooden casing made of oak planks, with an ash handle. Daniel installed it by the lower terrace. Tobias turned the handle. Water rose in a spiral and flowed into the upper trough. Upward, against gravity. The village watched. Nolan's mouth fell open. Merrick shook his head. Old woman Gwen crossed herself. Father Garrett stood to the side, silent. His face was inscrutable, but Daniel noticed that he wasn't looking at the screw. He was looking at the water, at the way it was rising, as if trying to understand. Tobias turned the handle and laughed. For the first time ever, he was laughing. He said it was the craziest thing he'd ever seen in his life. The water was going up. Daniel said the water wasn't going up, the propeller was lifting it. They were two different things. Tobias said that to him, they were one and the same, and he kept turning the handle. Sora stood nearby, looking at her work. There was no smile on her face. She was focused. She was already thinking about what could be improved. Daniel saw it. He knew that look. He looked at his own projects that way, always. What could be done better, faster, more reliably? That evening, Daniel sat on the upper terrace and looked out at the village. The canals, the water catchment, the terraces, the sorghum sprouts, the Archimedes screw. Over the course of 2 months, the barren, lifeless land had begun to come alive. Slowly. Drop by drop. Sprout by sprout. Liter by liter of water. He thought about how, back in Oregon, he'd had an office with air conditioning and a coffee machine. Here, he had a barn with straw and a bowl of porridge. And yet, he didn't feel like he'd lost anything. He felt like he was finally doing what he'd studied for over 15 years. No bureaucracy, no reports, no approvals. Just the land and water and the people who needed it right now. Ella approached, silent as always. She sat down beside him. A minute later, she said that tomorrow a caravan of merchants from the south would arrive at the village. They pass through Sukhoi Broad every 2 months. They trade in salt and fabrics. Usually, the village has nothing to pay with, so they just pass by. But this time, Merrick wants to offer them water. Clean water. For the horses and for the people. Not for free. In exchange for salt. Daniel looked at her. Then he looked at the canal, glistening in the moonlight. Water. Currency. He nodded and said that was the right thing to do. Ella said there was something else. The caravan members would spread the word. They'd tell other villages that there's water in Sukhoi Broad. The news would spread. That meant the Baron wouldn't hear it from just one sentry. He'd hear it from 10 merchants, and from 20 peasants, and he wouldn't be able to pretend he didn't know anymore. Daniel understood. The time for quiet work was coming to an end. Another war lay ahead. Not with the land, with the people who stood to gain from the drought. The caravan arrived at dawn. 6 wagons, 12 horses, 20 men. Merchants from the southern domain. Salt, fabrics, ironware. The caravan leader was a heavy-set man named Bartos, a broad beard, shrewd eyes. His hands were adorned with silver rings. He stopped the wagons at the village entrance and jumped down to the ground. He looked around. He saw the canal. He saw the damp earth around the settling pond. He saw the greenery on the terraces. His eyebrows crept upward. He had been coming to Sukhoi Broad twice a year for the past 10 years, and each time the village had been drier and more lifeless. The horses didn't even stop. There was nothing to see. Merrick came out to meet him. They exchanged greetings. Bartosz asked where the water was coming from. Merrick pointed to Daniel, who was standing by the terrace explaining something to Tobias. Bartosz looked at the stranger, at his odd clothes, at his boots, which by now were worn out and tied with string, but still didn't look like local footwear. Bartosz walked over and introduced himself. He asked if it was true that Daniel had built the canals. Daniel said the village had built them. He'd only shown them where to dig. Bartosz chuckled. He said he knew the value of modesty, and that he needed water for his horses, 12 horses after a 3-day journey. Each would drink 20 liters. 240 liters. How much? Merrick named his price, 2 sacks of salt. Bartosz looked at him, then at the water, then back at Merrick. He nodded. 2 sacks of salt for water that flowed from the ground. Daniel watched this transaction and realized he was witnessing the birth of an economy. Not an abstract one, a real one. A village that 2 months ago couldn't even give its children enough to drink had just sold water for salt. Salt they hadn't had for 2 years. Salt that preserves meat and fish. Salt that turns food into more than just calories, into nourishment. The horses drank from a special trough that Tobias had knocked together from planks and coated with clay. Daniel made sure the water was drawn from the lower channel and not from the drinking reservoir, separating the flows, clean water for people, service water for livestock and irrigation. He'd had this in mind from day one, but he hadn't explained it right away. People had to see first that there was enough water. Then they would understand that it needed to be distributed. Now they were ready to understand. Bartosz stayed in the village for 2 days. He traded in salt and fabrics. The village had nothing to pay him with except water and a few baskets of dried roots that Hana had gathered in the hills. But Bartosz accepted even that. He was a merchant. He wasn't thinking about today, but about tomorrow. And his eyes saw the terraces that would yield a harvest in 2 months. He saw the canals that were functioning. He saw people moving not as if they were doomed, but as if they were alive. And he understood that in half a year, Sokoibrod would become a place where grain could be bought. The evening before his departure, Bartosz found Daniel by the water catchment. He sat down beside him. He asked, point blank, how much was Daniel's knowledge worth? He said he had partners in 4 villages to the south. They were all suffering from the drought. If Daniel traveled with his caravan and built something similar, Bartosz named a price, silver, a lot by local standards. Daniel shook his head. He said he wouldn't go, not now. Dry Ford wasn't finished yet. The system wasn't stable. There were no supplies, no reserves. If he left and the canal got clogged in a month, no one would know how to fix it. Bartosz asked when. Daniel said in 6 months, maybe sooner, when he'd trained people who could do it without him. Bartosz looked at him for a long time. Then he said it was the first time he'd seen a man turn down money because he had principles. Usually, people with principles have nothing to eat and quickly become people without principles. Daniel replied that he had something to eat. A bowl of porridge. Bartosz snorted. He stood up, he left. The caravan set off the next morning. But Daniel knew that Bartosz's words weren't just idle chatter. It was an offer, and it would come back. And along with Bartosz's words, stories left with the caravan. About the village with water, about the canals, about the stranger. Merchants are the best news carriers, faster than pigeons, more reliable than rumors. Within a week, every village along the trade route, from the northern foothills to the southern coast, would know about Sukhoi Broad. A week had passed since the caravan's departure. Daniel began the project he'd been waiting for since day one, contour plowing. He gathered everyone who worked on the terraces and explained. Terraces are good for slopes, but the flat land east of the village could also yield a harvest. The problem is that the furrows run straight along the slope. Water runs down them like a gutter. It washes away the soil. It carries away the seeds. The solution is simple. The furrow should run not along the slope, but across it, following the contours of the terrain. Each furrow acts like a small dam. The water is held back. It soaks in. It doesn't run off. He showed them how to mark out the contours. A stick and a rope. A simple level made from a water bottle. Tobias watched and shook his head. He said he'd been plowing in straight lines his whole life. His father plowed in straight lines. His grandfather plowed in straight lines. And now some stranger was saying he should use curved lines. Daniel replied that curved lines follow the land. Straight lines fight against it. Tobias thought about it. He looked at the field. He looked at the slope. Then he said, "All right, show me." They spent 2 days marking out the lines, 3 days plowing, with an old wooden plow that Sora had reinforced with an iron plowshare from her father's blacksmith shop. The work was hard, but when the first 1 hectare section had been plowed along the contour, Daniel put on a demonstration. He took a bucket of water. He poured it onto the top furrow of the old straight plot. The water ran downhill, quickly, like a little stream. Within a minute, it had disappeared over the edge of the field, carrying with it a strip of dark soil, the topsoil. Then he poured the bucket onto the top furrow of the new contoured plot. The water spread across the furrow. It lingered. It began to soak in. After a minute, half of it had been absorbed. The other half slowly flowed into the next furrow. After 2 minutes, there was no water left on the surface. It had all gone into the ground, right where it was needed. Tobias watched. Ella watched. Hana watched. 20 people were watching. Silence. Then Tobias said one word. He said he understood. Daniel nodded. He understood. It was the most valuable word he'd heard since his arrival. That evening, Emily came to see Daniel. He hadn't known her before. A young woman, 25 years old, pale, slender, hands not made for manual labor, the hands of someone who held a quill, not a shovel. Her hair was hidden under a simple scarf. Her eyes were intelligent and sad at the same time. She said she had come from the Seven Clouds Monastery, that she had been a novice for 4 years, that she had left. Don't ask why. Daniel didn't ask. She said she'd heard about him from Bartos's caravan, which had passed by the monastery, and that she could read and write in 3 languages, and that if he needed someone to record what he was doing, she was ready. In exchange for food and a roof over her head. Daniel looked at her. Then he asked why she wanted to do this. Emily was silent for a moment. Then she said that for 3 years at the monastery, she'd told dying children that it was the will of the gods, and that one morning she woke up and couldn't bring herself to say it anymore, because it was a lie. The gods don't want children to die of thirst, and if they do, those aren't the gods worth serving. She said this quietly, but there was steel in her voice. Daniel nodded. He said the records were necessary, that without documentation, any system dies within a generation. People forget, they distort, they lose things. To record is to preserve. Emily asked what exactly to record. Daniel said everything. The depth of the canals, the slopes, the distances, soil types, planting patterns, water usage, results, mistakes, especially mistakes, because you learn not from successes, but from what went wrong. Emily took a bundle of blank sheets out of her bag, expensive ones, parchment. She'd brought them from the monastery, the only thing she'd taken with her, and a quill and ink in a clay vial. She sat down beside him and said she was ready. Daniel began to dictate. Channel number 1. The main channel. Length 420 meters. Slope 1.5%. Half a meter wide, half a meter deep. The walls are reinforced with 2 layers of clay. Source: the aquifer beneath the northern hill. Depth of occurrence: 2.5 meters. Flow rate: about 200 liters per day under current conditions. Emily wrote quickly in neat, small handwriting. She didn't ask for clarification. She didn't get the numbers mixed up. Daniel dictated and watched as his knowledge took shape for the first time in this world. Not in the ground, on paper. That was more important than any canal. A canal can be destroyed. Knowledge on paper can be copied, distributed, passed on. As long as the text exists, the system won't die. They worked until midnight. Emily filled 6 sheets of paper, front and back, descriptions of all the systems they'd built, diagrams, numbers, notes. Daniel looked at the filled-in sheets and thought that this was the first textbook on hydraulic engineering in this world. Flawed, incomplete, written by the light of an oil lamp in a village barn. But the first. Emily neatly folded the sheets and tucked them into her bag. Then she looked at Daniel and said he was a strange man, not like a priest, not like a lord, not like a merchant. He doesn't promise heaven or threaten hell. He just says, here's the canal and here's the water. Daniel replied that it was because the canal and the water were real. As for heaven and hell, he hadn't checked them out. For the first time all evening, Emily smiled. Subtly, barely noticeably, but she smiled. 2 days after Emily's arrival, what Daniel had feared happened. In the morning, Nolan ran up to him, his eyes wide. Horsemen were riding down the road from the north, 3 of them, wearing the colors of Baron Morway. Daniel went out to the road. Ella and Tobias stood beside him. Merrick stood by the community hall and watched. The horsemen stopped. The eldest dismounted. A man of about 40, not a warrior, an administrator. His clothes were expensive. His hands were clean. Instead of a sword, he had a leather pouch with papers on his belt. He introduced himself. Graham, steward of the Morway barony for the Western District. He had come on the Baron's orders, on an inspection. Daniel stood there in silence. Graham walked through the village, slowly, carefully. He looked at the canal. He touched the walls. He examined the water collector. He stood at the edge for a long time. He walked along the terraces. He bent down to look at the seedlings. He touched the soil. He looked at the Archimedes screw. He turned the handle. He watched as the water rose up the spiral. His face betrayed nothing. Professional detachment. He saw everything and gave nothing away. Then he returned to Daniel. He asked who he was. Daniel repeated the legend. A wanderer, a builder. Graham asked who had given him the right to build on the Baron's lands. Daniel replied that the peasants had the right to cultivate their own plots. Canals are part of that cultivation. Graham smiled subtly. He said that canals weren't just furrows in a vegetable garden, that waterworks fell under the Lord's jurisdiction, and that Baron Morway was interested in the results. The word interested sounded like a knife being drawn from its sheath, slowly, with a distinct sound. Graham said he would return in a month with a proposal from the Baron, and that until his return, there would be no new construction. Daniel looked him in the eye and asked why. Graham replied that it was because the Baron had said so. He turned around, mounted his horse, and rode away. 20 people went to work the next morning, the entire village except for the elderly and young children. Even Father Garrett stood by the chapel, silently watching as the people picked up their shovels and pickaxes. He didn't go with them, but he didn't preach against it either. That was enough. Daniel divided the people into 4 teams. The first, led by Tobias, dug the second catchment basin. It was south of the first one, lower down the slope and smaller in size, 6 by 12 meters, but deeper at 3 meters. This catchment basin wasn't for irrigation, it was for storage, a reserve in case the first one dried up or if it was cut off. Daniel thought about this every day. What if the Baron cut it off? The second crew, led by Ella, was expanding the terraces on the western slope. The third crew was clearing the route for the new canal, the very one leading to the Baron's fields. The fourth. 3 people, Sora and 2 guys from the village. They were building the second water wheel, a water lifting mechanism for the new catchment basin. Sora worked quickly. She no longer checked her work against Daniel's blueprints. She drew her own, on scraps of bark, on flat stones, with charcoal. Her lines were more precise than Daniel's, smoother. She hadn't been taught this. It was innate, like a musician's ear. Daniel walked among the work crews, checking, correcting, explaining. He gave each explanation only once, then he'd ask the person he'd explained it to. Repeat. Why is the slope 1.5%? Why are the walls 2 layers of clay? Why is the drainage channel narrower than the main channel? People answered, at first hesitantly, then more precisely. Then they began correcting each other on their own. Daniel watched as knowledge flowed from his mind into theirs, slowly, drop by drop, like water through a channel. Emily followed behind with a parchment, writing everything down, every section, every measurement, every mistake. Daniel dictated additions to her in the evenings: how to identify an aquifer by its vegetation, how to calculate the volume of a reservoir based on the catchment area, how to choose a location for a well. Emily took notes and asked questions, smart questions. She didn't ask how it worked. She asked why it had to be that way and not another. Daniel answered, and with each answer, he felt his knowledge becoming something greater, not just a collection of facts in one mind, a system on paper, one that could be passed on. On the third day, the canal route to the Baron's fields was marked out. Daniel walked the entire route on foot, 2 kilometers from the village to the eastern border. The terrain allowed for it. The slope was gentle, about 1%. The soil was soft, with no rocks. Digging it would be easier than digging the main canal. The problem was the length. 2 kilometers is 10 days' work for a crew of 6. He had 5 days. Then the rainy season would begin. Maybe. If it began. He stood at the edge of the future route and calculated in his head. 6 people, 10 hours a day. Each person digs about 4 meters of canal a day in soft soil. 6 people, 24 meters a day. 2 kilometers is 214 days. He recalculated. 83 days. No, he was wrong. 2 kilometers is 2,000 meters. 24 meters a day. 83 days. He doesn't have 83 days. He has 30. Maybe fewer. That means he needs 20 people just for this canal. People he doesn't have. People who are all busy on other sections. Daniel sat down on a rock and closed his eyes. He thought. Then he opened his eyes and went to Ella. He told her the plan was changing. The canal to the Baron's fields won't run in a straight line. It will follow the bed of a dead river. The old riverbed has already been carved out by water, by nature, thousands of years ago. We just need to clear it out, deepen it in some places, reinforce the walls where they've collapsed. That's not 2 kilometers of digging. It's 2 kilometers of clearing, 3 times faster. Ella asked what if the riverbed didn't go where they needed it to? Daniel said that the riverbed went exactly where they needed it to, because the river once flowed along the same slope along which the canal needed to be built. Water is smarter than people. It always finds the best path. All we have to do is clean up after it. Work on the riverbed began that very day. Daniel assigned 10 men to the task. Tobias led the crew. The clearing went quickly. The riverbed was clogged with rocks, dry branches, and deposited sand. But beneath the debris lay a smooth, clay-like bottom, solid, like the walls of a catchment basin. Natural waterproofing. Water had flowed here for thousands of years, and the earth remembered. On the 5th day, the cleared riverbed connected with the main canal. Daniel opened the sluice gate. Water began to flow through the old riverbed, slowly, in a thin stream. The riverbed was wide, and the water spread across the bottom without gaining depth. But it was flowing, meter by meter, along the path where the river once flowed. On the 7th day, something happened that changed everything. Rain. The first in 4 months. It started at night. Daniel woke up to a sound, a strange sound, unfamiliar in this world. A tapping on the shed's roof. Rapid, steady. He jumped up and ran outside. Darkness, wind, and water from the sky. Warm, heavy, a real downpour. Daniel stood in the rain and felt the water running down his face, down his arms, down his clothes. He stood there, staring into the darkness and listening. Not rain, the ground. He heard the water hitting the dry earth, how it ran down the slopes, how it flowed through the ditches he dug to catch the rainwater, how it found its way to the catch basin. He ran toward the first catch basin. In the darkness, through the mud, he slipped, he fell, he got up, he ran on. He reached the edge. He knelt down and looked down. Even in the dark, he could see it. He could hear it. Water was pouring into the catch basin from all sides, through the channels, down the gutters, along the guides. Every liter of rain that fell within a 300-meter radius found its way here. The collection system was working. Daniel knelt by the catchment basin in the pouring rain and laughed. Quietly. Alone. In the dark. In the morning, the rain stopped. Daniel went out to the catchment basin at dawn. The water stood at 70 centimeters. One downpour. One night. 140 cubic meters of water. More than the underground spring would yield in a year. He stood at the edge and looked at the dark, still water. Clean. Collected. Preserved. Behind him, the village was gathering. People were coming out of their houses and walking toward the catchment basin, silently, just as they had walked toward the pit on the hill 2 months ago. Only this time, the scale was different. It wasn't a puddle at the bottom of a narrow pit. It was a lake. A small one, man-made, but a lake nonetheless. Martha stood at the edge and cried, openly, loudly. Her grandson stood beside her, holding her hand, and cried too because his grandmother was crying. Merrick stood there in silence. His face was wet, but not from the rain. Tobias crouched down at the edge and scooped up some water with his palm. He looked at it, then at Daniel. He said that the water had gone exactly where Daniel had said it would, that it hadn't seeped into the ground like before. It hadn't washed away the furrows. It hadn't flowed down as a stream into the ravine. It had come here, into the pit they dug, because Daniel knew where the water would go. Daniel said it wasn't him who knew. The channels knew. The furrows knew. The slope knew. He'd just done the math. Tobias shook his head and said it was all the same. Father Garrett stood off to the side. He looked at the catch basin for a long time. His lips moved. Maybe he was praying. Maybe he was counting. Daniel didn't know, but he noticed that when Garrett left, he didn't turn toward the chapel. He went home, like an ordinary person, not like a priest. Ella approached Daniel. She stood beside him, silently, as always. Then she quietly said 2 words. She said that Lyra would have seen it. Daniel understood. He didn't reply. They stood at the edge of the catchment basin and watched the water. An hour later, Daniel opened the drainage channels. The water flowed onto the terraces, into the contoured fields, to the sorghum sprouts, which in 2 months had grown to 30 centimeters and stood thin and pale, waiting. The water reached them through the channels, down the gutters, through the distributor, exactly as much as was needed. The earth absorbed the water and darkened. The seedlings stood in the wet soil, and if plants could breathe a sigh of relief, they would have done so. Hana walked through the fields, checking on them. The legumes on the upper terraces had gained strength. Tiny white flowers had opened after the rain. This meant that in a month, there would be pods. The sorghum on the lower terraces had come to life. The foliage had become brighter. The stalks were thicker. The roots held the soil in place. The terraces had withstood the downpour. Not a single retaining wall had been washed away. The stones and clay held firm. The contour furrows in the eastern field had worked perfectly. Water had pooled in every furrow. It had been absorbed. It didn't run off. The soil was moist throughout the entire depth of the topsoil, 20 centimeters. Daniel stood at the edge of the field and watched. He thought that in Oregon, for a result like this, he would have been praised at a meeting and awarded a bonus. Here, for this result, he could have been killed. Because every liter of water he saved in Sukhoi Broad was a liter that Baron Morway had lost. Not literally. The water didn't belong to the Baron, but control over it did. And Daniel had just proven that control wasn't necessary, that water obeys not the Lord, but the slope. The next 2 weeks were spent in a frenzy of work. The second rain came 4 days after the first. It was lighter, but the collection system gathered another 60 cubic meters. The reservoir filled to 1 meter 20, more than 200 cubic meters, enough for 2 months of irrigation. Daniel shifted his main forces to the canal leading to the Baron's fields. The clearing of the riverbed was progressing. 1 kilometer, 1.5. At the 1,700-meter mark, the channel ran into a rocky ridge. The old river had bypassed it in a 300-meter loop. Daniel could have replicated the loop, or cut through the ridge. He chose a third option. He dug a bypass. 200 meters through soft soil, bypassing the ridge, shorter than the loop, more direct. Tobias led a crew of 12 men. They dug like madmen, because everyone understood. The month was almost over. Manager Graham would be back, with papers or with swords, and by then, the canal had to be ready. It had to irrigate the Baron's fields. It had to be a lever. On the 28th day, the canal reached the eastern border of the village lands, 2 kilometers. Daniel opened the sluice gate on the main canal. The water flowed along the old channel, slowly, over the cleared bed, following the natural slope, meter by meter, kilometer by kilometer. By evening, it had reached the end. Daniel stood at the eastern border and watched as the water crossed the invisible line, from the village lands to the barrens. Before him lay fields, dry, cracked, dead. The Baron's peasants tilled them haphazardly, without a system, without knowledge, with prayer and hope. And the water flowing through Daniel's canal could bring them back to life. Over the course of a day, the canal provided the Baron's fields with about 50 liters per meter. A drop, but a visible one. The earth along the canal darkened. Grass began to sprout. 3 days later, the Baron's peasants from the nearest farmstead came to the border and looked at the canal. In silence. Just as the residents of Suchibrod had looked at the pit of water 2 months earlier. Then one of them filled a jug with water and carried it home. Then another came, and another. Daniel stood on his side of the border and watched. Graham returned exactly 1 month later, just as he had promised. But he wasn't alone. 2 fully armed knights rode with him, chainmail, swords, and shields bearing the Morway coat of arms. This was no longer an inspection. It was a statement. The village fell silent. People dropped their tools and stared at the road. The women scooped up their children. Merrick stepped out to meet the horsemen. His face was ashen. Daniel stood 3 paces behind the village elder. Tobias was beside him. Ella was beside him. Graham dismounted. The knights remained in the saddle. Graham unrolled the scroll and began to read. His voice was steady, impassive, the voice of a man who had read such things hundreds of times. Baron Halden Morway hereby declares the entry into force of the right of first water within the territory of the village of Sukhoi Broad. All water structures, including canals, catchments, and lifting mechanisms, are transferred to the barony's control. The village is required to pay a water tax amounting to 1/3 of all water collected. An administrator is appointed by the baron to oversee distribution. Any new construction of water facilities requires the baron's written permission. Violations are punishable by confiscation of property and arrest. Graham rolled up the scroll and looked at Daniel. He waited for a reaction. Daniel was silent for 5 seconds. 10. Then he said one thing. He asked if the Baron knew that his fields on the eastern border were already receiving water from the Sukhoi Broad Canal. Graham blinked. He didn't know. Daniel continued. He said that over the past 2 weeks, the Baron's peasants from the eastern farmstead had been watering their vegetable gardens with water from that canal. That 3 of them had started planting on plots that had been abandoned for 2 years. That one family had stopped packing their belongings to leave for the south because, for the first time, they had irrigation. Daniel said this calmly, without any pressure, just as a matter of fact. Then he added that there was a gate on the canal, and that if control passed to the Baron would, of course, decide whether to open or close it. But if the gate were closed, the Baron's peasants would be the first to lose their water, because they were at the lower end. The village was at the upper end. The village had catchment basins. The Baron's peasants have nothing. Graham looked at Daniel. The knights behind him exchanged glances. One of them shifted slightly in his saddle. He felt uncomfortable, not physically, but morally. He was from these parts. He knew the peasants on the eastern farmstead. Graham asked coldly if this was a threat. Daniel shook his head. He said it was a matter of hydraulics. Water flows from top to bottom. Whoever controls the top controls everything below. It's not a threat. It's physics. Graham was silent for a minute. Then he said he would relay the message to the Baron. He mounted his horse. He rode off. The knights followed him. The village breathed a sigh of relief. But Daniel didn't. He knew this wasn't the end. It was a reprieve. Baron Morway was a smart man. He'd realized that Daniel was playing on his dependence, and he'd find a way to get around it, or break it. Over the next few days, Daniel worked not on the land, but in his mind. He sat with Emily in the evenings and dictated to her. Not technical notes, but something else. He dictated a plan, a long-term one, for the year ahead. First, train at least 5 people from the village in the entire process, from finding water to building a canal, so that each of them could go to any village and repeat what Daniel had done. Second, start working in neighboring villages, not by himself, through the people he'd trained. If one village with water can be crushed, 10 cannot. Third, create a formal structure. Give it a name. Establish rules for it. A charter, a public face, so that it's not about one outsider, but about an organization. An organization is harder to destroy than a person. He called it the Guild of Watermasters. Emily wrote down the name and looked at him. She said it sounded serious. Daniel said that's exactly how it should sound. Serious. Because people believe in names. A baron believes in his title. The church believes in its name. The guild would believe in its cause. Tobias and Ella became the first apprentices. Daniel started with the basics. How to read topography. How to determine slope without instruments. How to find an aquifer by observing vegetation. How to calculate the volume of a catchment basin. Tobias learned slowly but surely. Whatever entered his mind stayed there. Ella learned faster but differently. She didn't memorize formulas. She understood the logic. Daniel explained to her once why a canal's slope must be between 0.5% and 3%. Ella listened and said she understood. Too little and the water sleeps. Too much and the water gets angry. You need the water to flow. Daniel laughed. It was the best explanation of hydraulic gradient he'd ever heard. Hana taught something else. She was compiling a catalog of local plants. Which ones grow where, which ones indicate the presence of water, which ones thrive in good soil, which ones in clay, which ones on rock. Daniel combined her knowledge with his own. Together, they created a system that Daniel called the Hana-Daniel Protocol, a method for determining a site's suitability for irrigation based on vegetation composition. Emily transcribed the protocol, 5 pages, with descriptions of the plants, with drawings that Hana had made, delicate, precise, and botanically accurate. Hana saw her name on the title page, Hana Daniel. She stood there, staring at the letters. Then she looked up at Daniel and asked why her name came first. He replied that it was because she knew this land, while he only knew what to do with it. The land comes first. Hana said nothing, but Daniel noticed that she worked the entire next day without looking up, and that in the evening she sat down next to Emily and began dictating additions to the protocol, on her own, without being asked. For the first time in her life, her knowledge had a name and a place. Meanwhile, Sora was working on her third project, a shadoof, a lever-operated water lifting device. Simpler than a Noria, more reliable. A long lever with a counterweight, a bucket at one end, a stone at the other. You lower the bucket into the canal, the stone lifts it back up. You pour the water into a trough, you repeat the process. One person can lift 500 liters a day effortlessly. Sora built her first shadoof in 2 days. She set it up by the lower canal. She showed Nolan how to use it. The boy got the hang of it in 10 minutes and pumped water until dark, until Ella sent him off to bed. Master Pak came to look at the shadoof. He stood there for a long time. He felt the joints, he checked the balance of the lever, then he looked at his daughter and said nothing. But that evening, he brought her a new set of tools to the shed where she was working. His own, the ones he'd kept for 20 years. Sora took them in silence. They didn't hug, they didn't say a word to each other. But Daniel saw Master Pak walking away into the darkness, and how his back was a little straighter than usual. A week later, news arrived. Not from the Baron, from the neighbors, the village of Glinty, 20 kilometers to the south. They'd sent 2 people, a man and a woman. They came on foot, a 2-day journey. They'd heard about Drive Forward from Bartos's caravan. They wanted to know if it was true. Ella showed them the canals, the catch basins, the terraces, the fields where the sorghum was already knee-high, green, lush. They watched in silence. Then the man from Glint's said that they, too, had hills, and a dry riverbed, and land that had once been good. He asked if someone could come to them and show them. Daniel looked at Tobias. Tobias looked at Daniel, silently. Then he said he would go, that he knew how to find water, how to lay out a canal, how to calculate the slope. Daniel said Tobias wasn't ready, that he needed 2 more months. Tobias replied that the people of Glint's didn't have 2 months. They had until the end of the rainy season. After that, it would be too late. Daniel was silent. Then he nodded. He knew Tobias was right, and that sometimes the best way to teach is to let go. Tobias left with the people from Glint's the next morning, with a shovel, with a copy of the Khan Daniel Protocol, with 3 sheets of blueprints that Emily had copied out for him. Ella stood by the road and watched him go. When he disappeared behind the hill, she turned to Daniel and said that if anything happened to him, she would personally find Daniel and drown him in his own catch basin. Daniel nodded. He had no doubt she was capable of it. 2 months had passed since the first rain. Sequoia Broad was harvesting. It was the first real harvest in 4 years. The sorghum on the lower terraces stood waist high. The heavy panicles bent under the weight of the grain. The legumes on the upper terraces had produced pods, small and bitter, but there were plenty of them. The contoured fields to the east yielded twice as much as expected. The land irrigated using Daniel's system yielded everything it had stored up. Hana walked through the fields and counted. She wasn't counting sacks, but calories, how much grain per person per day, how many beans, and how many root vegetables the women were growing in their small garden plots near their homes. She finished her calculations and went to see Daniel that evening. She told him that the village would have enough to last until the next harvest, with a surplus. For the first time in 4 years, Sequoia Broad would have extra food. Extra. The word spread through the village, and people couldn't believe it. Because there had never been anything extra here. There was never extra water. There was never extra food. There was never a day of life to spare. Everything was counted. Everything was saved. Everything was stretched to the limit. And suddenly, there was a surplus. Daniel stood on the upper terrace and looked down, at the fields, at the people with sickles, at the women tying sheaves, at the children running between the rows and gathering fallen grains, at the old men sitting in the shade and watching, at Garrett's father, who stood among the reapers, with a sickle in his hand, silently, working. Daniel watched this and felt something big and heavy in his chest. Not joy, something deeper. The realization that this was what it was all for. For this very scene. For the old people crying as they looked at the grain. For the children eating their fill. For the woman laughing because she had an extra sack of sorghum and didn't know what to do with it. This was what he'd been studying for 15 years. Ella walked over to him. She stood beside him. She was silent for a long time. Then she said the words he would remember forever. She said that he understood what he had done. Daniel replied that he hadn't done anything, that they were the ones who had dug it up. Ella was silent. Then she said quietly, she said that none of them had ever believed before that it was possible to dig it up. That he hadn't brought water. He had brought what was possible. Daniel didn't answer because he didn't know what to say. They stood there watching the sunset over the green fields where, a year ago, there had been nothing but dust. 3 days after the cleanup began, Tobias returned to the village. He wasn't alone. 4 men from Glintz came with him. Tobias looked different, tanned to the point of being black, thin, but his eyes were ablaze. He walked up to Daniel and said he'd dug a well, all by himself. He'd found water 3 meters down. He'd dug a canal 100 meters long. He'd started building terraces. The men from Glintz were working. The 4 had come with him to see Sukhoi Broad and learn more. Daniel listened and nodded. Then he asked what the channel's slope was. Tobias said 2%. Daniel asked why not 1.5%. Tobias said that the soil in Glintz was sandy, and at 1.5%, the water would seep into the walls before reaching the end. 2% compensates for the loss. Daniel looked at him. Tobias hadn't just repeated what he'd memorized. He'd adapted it. He'd thought it through. He'd solved a problem that wasn't in the textbook. Because the textbook was written for Sukhoi Broad, and Glintz was a different kind of terrain. And Tobias understood that. Daniel held out his hand. Tobias shook it, firmly. He was the first water master. A real one. The 4 from Glintz spent 10 days in Dry Ford. Daniel taught them. Ella taught them. Hannah demonstrated the protocol. Emily gave each of them a copy of the notes. 3 sheets, the basics. How to find water, how to build a canal, how to calculate a catchment basin. They left with the shovels that Master Pak had forged, with the blueprints that Sora had drawn, with copies of the protocol that Emily had transcribed, and with grain. 2 sacks of sorghum, a gift from Sukhoi Broad to a village that had once been just as dead. A week later, news arrived from Tobias. He sent a young messenger. In Glintz, the canal was up and running. Water had reached the village. People were crying, just like in Dry Ford 4 months ago. Daniel listened to the messenger and thought about how knowledge multiplies, like water. 1 canal becomes 2, 2 become 10, 10 become 100, and each subsequent one is built faster because every new master teaches 2 more. Exponential growth, not of technology, of people. The tax to the Baron was paid in silver, in full, for the first time in 4 years. Merrick personally delivered 3 sacks of coins to the Baron's court. He returned 2 days later, gray, silent. Ella asked what had happened. Merrick said the Baron had accepted the tax in silence. He didn't thank him. He didn't ask how the village had grown rich. He knew. Steward Graham stood nearby, holding the papers. A map lay on the Baron's table. Merrick caught a glimpse of it. The canals of Dry Ford were marked on the map. All of them. Exactly. Someone had drawn them for the Baron. Someone who had seen them up close. Merrick didn't know who. Daniel listened and nodded. He had expected this. The Baron was gathering information. He was preparing. The only question was, for what? For negotiations or for force? The answer came 2 weeks later, on horseback. Not Graham, not the knights. A messenger in the barony's livery, with an official invitation. Baron Halden Morway invites the builder Daniel Rains to an audience at Morway Castle in 5 days. Daniel read the invitation. He looked at Ella. She was pale. She said there were 2 roads leading to the castle, there and back, or just there. Daniel said he would go. Ella said she would go with him. Daniel said no. If they didn't let him go, the village would need someone who knew the system. Ella, Hannah, Sora, Emily. They'll carry on. Ella clenched her jaw and said nothing, but Daniel saw her hands. White knuckles, clenched fists. He set out 3 days later, on the donkey Merrick had given him, alone, with a bag containing a map. His map, a detailed one, with every canal, every catchment basin, every gate. He rode along the dusty road, thinking that he was heading toward a man who might kill him, and that the only weapon in his bag was a sheet of parchment with lines drawn on it. Morway Castle stood on a hill, stone, old, not enormous but sturdy, walls 3 meters thick, a tower, a dry moat. How ironic. The Baron who controls the province's water lives behind a dry moat. Daniel rode into the courtyard. He dismounted. Graham met him. Silently, he led him across the courtyard, up the stairs, into the hall. The hall was long and dark, stone walls, narrow windows, a blackwood table. A man sat at the table. Baron Halden Morway, 47 years old, tall, thin, an elongated face, gray eyes, intelligent, cold. His hands on the table, long fingers, no rings. He looked at Daniel the way a scientist looks at an insect doing something unexpected, with interest, without fear, without respect, with interest. The Baron spoke first. He said that Daniel had created a problem for him. Daniel replied that he had brought water to the village. The Baron smiled slightly. He said it was one and the same thing, because water in the peasants' hands is a problem for the Lord. Not because the Lord is evil, because order is maintained through need. If the peasants don't need the Lord, then what's the point of the Lord? Daniel listened. The Baron spoke calmly, without malice, like a man explaining the obvious. He said he had ruled the province of Caldric for 22 years, that during those years there had been 3 droughts, 2 plagues, 1 rebellion, which he had quelled in a week. 400 people had died. He said this without emotion, as if reciting statistics. He said that order comes at the cost of blood, and that if Daniel thought the Canals would replace order, then he was a fool. Daniel listened. Then he took a map out of his bag. He unfolded it on the table. The Baron looked at it. The map showed all the canals of Dry Ford, and the canal leading to the Baron's fields. And future canals to 4 more villages were marked with dotted lines. Daniel said he didn't want to replace order. He wanted to change its foundation. Right now, the system is based on scarcity. Scarcity creates dependence. Dependence creates submission. Submission creates order. But submission also creates weakness. Hungry peasants don't pay taxes. Dead peasants don't work. Empty villages do not feed the barony. He proposed a different model. Abundance creates taxes. Taxes create the baron's wealth. Wealth creates true power, not the kind based on fear, but the kind based on money. The baron could become the richest lord in Valamore, not the most feared, but the richest. Daniel returned to Dryford the next day. Ella was waiting by the road. She'd been standing there since dawn. He saw her from a distance, her back straight, her arms crossed, her face stony. When he rode up on his donkey, she looked at him and exhaled, in a single motion, a short one, as if she'd been holding her breath since the moment he left. She asked what the Baron had said. Daniel dismounted the donkey. He stretched. His whole body ached from the journey. He said they had 6 months. Ella asked what for. Daniel said to make the Baron rich. Ella looked at him. Then she said he was crazy. Daniel replied that maybe he was, but a living madman was better than a dead sane man. That evening, he gathered everyone together. Ella, Hannah, Sora, Emily, Merrick, those who had returned from Glints. Chris and Owen came too. They stood silently against the wall. Daniel spoke. He said the Baron had set a deadline, 6 months. The province's tax revenue had to increase by 1/3. That meant not just Dryford would have to pay more, the entire province, every village. To do that, they needed water. Everywhere. Not in 5 years, in 6 months. He said he needed craftsmen, lots of them. 5 people who would go to 5 villages, with blueprints, with tools, with seeds, and they'd start digging. Tobias is already in Glints. 4 more are needed. Ella said she'd go. Daniel shook his head. He said Ella was needed here. She's the coordinator. She's the hub. Without her, Dryford would fall apart in a month. Ella clenched her jaw. She wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Chris and Owen volunteered, together. They said they'd go as a pair to one village. They work better as a team. Daniel nodded. Of the 4 Glints, 2 said they were ready to return and teach others. Their names were Reed and Fern, husband and wife, strong, calm. They'd seen Tobias at work and understood the principle. The 5th to volunteer was a boy Daniel hadn't expected, Nolan. The boy was 10 years old. He said he knew every rock and every ravine within a 10-kilometer radius, that he could be a guide, not a builder, a guide. He'd show them where the water was. Daniel looked at him. Then he looked at Ella. Ella nodded slightly. Daniel said that Nolan would go with Chris and Owen as a scout, not to dig, to observe, to search, to report. Nolan straightened up so that he looked 2 years older. The next 2 weeks were spent preparing. Emily rewrote the instructions. 6 sets. Each set consisted of 10 sheets. The Fundamentals of Hydraulic Engineering by Daniel Rains, How to Find Water, How to Build a Canal, How to Calculate a Catchment Basin, How to Lay Out Terraces, How to Organize Contour Plowing, the Khan Daniel Protocol, Blueprints for the Noria and Shadoof from Sora, a table of water consumption for irrigation, a list of mistakes and how to avoid them. Emily wrote for 12 hours a day. Her fingers were covered in ink up to her elbows. She was losing weight and growing pale, but she didn't stop. Daniel told her to rest. She replied that every day of delay was a day without water for someone's village. She didn't stop. Sora was forging. Master Pak worked beside her, in silence. They were forging plowshares, shovels tips, hinges for latches, rivets for water wheels. The forge ran from dawn until midnight. Sparks flew from the chimney. The heat was so intense that you couldn't touch the wall. Hannah gathered seeds. She walked through the fields and selected the best sorghum panicles, the best bean pods, grass seeds. She dried them, packed them into canvas pouches, labeled each one. Name, planting depth, spacing between holes, watering schedule. Each pouch was a little textbook. Daniel watched all this and realized that something bigger was happening than just preparing for planting in 5 villages. A system was being born. Not his system, their system. Each person added their own part to it. Emily added words. Sora added iron. Hana added soil. Ella added people. And Daniel. Daniel added only one thing: the conviction that it was possible. 2 weeks later, 4 groups set out from Dry Ford. Chris, Owen, and Nolan headed west, toward the village of Hamwick. Reed and Fern headed southwest, toward the village of Old Mill. 2 guys from Drybrook, whom Daniel had been training for the past month, headed north, toward the village of Redfall. And one more, a former apprentice of Master Pack, a quiet, burly guy named Grant. He headed east, toward the village of Oak Log. Each carried a bag of instructions, a sack of seeds, a set of tools from Sora's blacksmith shop, and a copy of the map Daniel had drawn, a map of Cauldric Province, with rivers, with hills, with ravines, with markings indicating where, according to his calculations, there might be aquifers. Daniel saw each group off. He told each one the same thing. Don't rush. Listen first, then dig. The first well isn't about water. It's about trust. And one more thing. If something goes wrong, come back. No shame, no embarrassment. Come back and we'll figure it out together. They set off along the dusty roads in different directions. 5 points on the map. 5 villages, 5 chances. Daniel stood on the hill and watched as the last figure disappeared over the horizon. Ella stood beside him. She said that now he was on his own, without the foreman, without the crew, with a village to maintain and develop. Daniel said he wasn't alone. He had her, and Hana, and Sora, and Emily, and 30 people who now knew that water flows downhill and that this was the only rule they needed to remember. Ella smiled slightly, for the first time in a long time. The next 4 months were the hardest and most fruitful of Daniel's life. He worked on several fronts at once. In Sukhoi Broad, he was finishing construction on the 3rd water catchment basin, expanding the terraces, laying small canals to every house, water in every yard, not a luxury, a necessity. If a woman doesn't have to walk a kilometer for water, she frees up 2 hours a day. 2 hours means weeding. It means tending the garden. It means repairing the house. 2 hours of water equals 2 hours of life. He designed a sewage system, the simplest kind. Drainage ditches from every yard to a settling pond behind the village. Redfall turned out to be a village twice the size of Sukhoi Brod, about 250 people. It stood in a narrow valley between 2 rocky ridges. The soil was better than in Sukhoi Brod, heavy loam, fertile, but there was no water. The river that once flowed along the valley floor had dried up 6 years ago, longer than in Sukhoi Brod. The people here lived on water brought in by the barrel every 2 weeks from the Baron's warehouse. For money. For a lot of money. A tithe per barrel. 1 barrel per family per week. That wasn't enough for anything but survival. Daniel rode into the village on a donkey at noon. The heat was so intense that the air shimmered above the rooftops. Silence. People weren't working in the fields. There were no fields. There were vegetable gardens, tiny ones, scorched, dead. He was met with wary glances. A stranger, strange clothes, a donkey from another village. Daniel asked where the village headman was. They pointed to a house in the center, large by local standards. 2 stories, stone foundation, wooden upper story. The headman stepped out onto the porch. A man in his 60s, heavy set, with a red face and small eyes. Evil looking. His name was Drake. Daniel introduced himself. He said he had come for his people. Drake said that Daniel's people were accused of heresy and witchcraft, that they had tried to dig up the ground without permission and without a blessing, that Father Lucas, the priest, had declared them possessed, that tomorrow they would be handed over to the Baron's court. Daniel listened calmly. Then he asked to meet with the priest. Drake looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. Father Lucas turned out to be young, 30 years old, no older, tall, handsome, with a voice that filled the room. He was sitting in the chapel at a table piled high with papers. Daniel walked in. He sat down across from him, without being invited. Lucas looked at him with irritation. Daniel didn't argue about heresy. He didn't explain that the channels weren't witchcraft. He didn't mention dry ford. Instead, he took out a map. He unfolded it on the table, and he said one thing. He said that he could see from the map that Redfall Chapel stood at the lowest point of the valley, and that if he was reading the topography correctly, there was an aquifer 4 meters below the chapel, and that if they let him dig a well on the chapel grounds, the water that would flow from that well would be holy, because it comes from beneath the house of God. Lucas fell silent. He looked at the map, at Daniel, back at the map. Daniel continued. He said that the people of Redfall pay the Baron a tithe for a barrel of water. If the chapel had its own well, the water would belong to the church, not the Barons, the churches. And the tithe would go not to the Baron, but to the church, to Father Lucas. The silence lasted a minute. Lucas was young, but not stupid. He understood arithmetic. 250 people, 1 barrel per family per week. About 50 families, 50 tithes a week, 200 a month. Right now, that money goes to the Baron. If the water comes from the church as well, it will go to the church. Lucas asked how Daniel knew there was water under the chapel. Daniel explained, the chapel stands at the lowest point in the valley. You can tell by the slope of the streets. Water always collects at the bottom. The same goes underground. The chapel walls are damp at the foundation. You can tell by the dark spots on the stone. Moss grows on the north side up to 1/2 meter high. That means moisture is rising from underground. 4 meters, maybe 5, but there's water down there. Lucas listened. His expression changed. His irritation faded. A sense of calculation took its place. He asked what Daniel wanted in return. Daniel listed 3 things. First, to release his men. Second, to let them finish their work. Third, to name the well in the chapel courtyard the Holy Spring of the 7 Clouds, so that people would come to it as a place of power, so that it would strengthen the church's authority rather than undermine it. Lucas thought for 5 minutes. Then he stood up. He held out his hand. Daniel shook it. By evening, the 2 men from Sukhoi Broad were released from the barn. They were hungry and frightened, but unharmed. Daniel fed them. He calmed them down. He explained what had happened. They left into the night and returned to Sukhoi Broad. Daniel stayed behind. The next morning, he began digging a well in the chapel's courtyard, by himself, with a shovel. Lucas stood nearby and watched. By noon, 3 men from the village had joined Daniel. By evening, there were 7 of them. On the second day, they reached wet clay at a depth of 3.5 meters. On the third day, the well yielded water. Clear, cold, abundant. More than in Sukhoi Broad. The aquifer in the valley was more abundant. Father Lucas stood by the well and silently gazed at the water. Then he lowered his hand. He scooped some up, tasted it, raised his eyes to the sky, and pronounced a blessing, loudly, solemnly, so that the whole village could hear. He said that the 7 clouds had heard Redfall's prayers, that the water had come through the house of God, that the holy spring would henceforth quench the village's thirst. People stood around watching. Some were crying. Some were praying. Some just stood there with their mouths agape. Daniel stood off to the side and watched. He saw how Lucas took control of the situation, how he took credit for it, how he turned the well into a church miracle. And Daniel didn't object, because he didn't care who got the credit. What mattered to him was that the water flowed. Let Lucas call it a miracle. Let the people call it a gift from God. The main thing was that the children would have something to drink. He spent 4 more days in Redfall. During that time, he marked out the route of the canal from the well to the southern part of the village. He showed the locals how to dig, what the slope should be, how deep to dig. He left a copy of the instructions. He left a blueprint of the catchment basin. Before leaving, Lucas came to see him. They stood at the gate of the chapel. Lucas said he'd been wrong about the guys from Drybrook, that he'd been too quick to judge, that he'd gotten used to seeing every stranger as a threat. Daniel said he understood. Lucas was silent for a moment. Then he said he would write a letter to Father Garrett and Sukhoi Broad, that the church should be united, not divided, especially now. Daniel nodded. He mounted the donkey and rode out of Redfall. On the road, he stopped and turned around. The village down in the valley, the well in the chapel courtyard. The water that had been a problem just yesterday had become the solution today. Not because Daniel was smart, but because he understood one thing. In a world where the church is stronger than logic, you need the church on your side. And the easiest way to do that is to give it what it wants: power, control, authority, through water. He rode back along the dusty road and counted 6 villages: Dryford, Glints, Hamwick, Old Mill, Oaklog, Redfall. 6 dots on the map, 6 water sources, 6 communities beginning to live anew. In 3 months, each of them will yield a harvest. In half a year, each will pay taxes. A year had passed since Daniel opened his eyes by the dried-up well. 12 months. 365 days. He kept track not because he missed the past. He kept track because an engineer always keeps track. Sukhoi Broad had changed beyond recognition. Not all at once. Not all at once. Drop by drop. Furrow by furrow. Sprout by sprout. The central square by the old well was paved with stone. Not smooth, not beautiful, but stone. Tobias had brought the idea from Glints, where the roads were paved with flat river stones. Next to the square stood the community hall, new, made of fired brick. Sora designed the kiln in a week. Master Pak built it in 2. The bricks were crooked and varied in color, but they held up the walls and didn't get soggy in the rain. A map hung on the wall of the community hall, a large one, on calfskin. Emily had spent 3 weeks drawing it, a map of Caldric Province, showing every canal, every reservoir, every village operating under the system. 12 locations, not 6, 12. Over the past 4 months, 6 more villages had sent people to Dryford to learn. Each received a master. Each received instructions. Each began digging. Tobias worked in Glints and coordinated the southern section. 3 villages were under his command. Chris and Owen had established themselves in Hamwick and led the western section. Rita and Fern held the southwest. Grant worked silently and methodically in the east. Redfall, under the supervision of Father Lucas, became a model for the church. Lucas wrote a letter to the bishop in the provincial capital. He described the holy spring. He described the harvest. He described how the water from beneath the chapel had saved the village. The bishop took an interest. He sent a deacon to investigate. The deacon saw for himself. He took the report back with them. The church began to turn around. Slowly, with difficulty, like a ship. But it began. Taxes started coming in. Merrick kept the records. Silver flowed into the Baron's treasury regularly. Each of the 12 villages paid. Not all in full, not all in silver, some in grain, some in livestock, but they paid. For the first time in 6 years, Baron Morway's treasury was being replenished, without threats and without soldiers. Daniel did the math. The province's tax revenue had increased, not by 1/3 as the Baron had demanded, but by 42%, with room to spare. He sent the figures to the Baron via Merrick. The reply came a week later, brief, terse. The Baron invited Daniel to a second audience. Daniel prepared to go. This time, Ella said she would go with him, and that arguing was pointless. Daniel looked at her face, at her hands, at the tan that, over the course of a year, had turned her skin a deep bronze, at the calluses that had become part of her palms, at her eyes, which were no longer weary. They were calm, strong. He nodded. The two of them set out together on 2 donkeys, a 2-day journey. They rode in silence. Ella didn't speak along the way. She looked around, at the fields, at the villages, at the people. Daniel noticed that she was looking at the ground the same way he had on the first day, reading the terrain, seeing the slopes, noticing where water gathered and where it flowed away. She had learned, not from books, from the land. Morway Castle looked the same, stone, old, a dry moat, but something had changed in the courtyard. Daniel noticed it right away. Grass, by the walls, green, thin, but green. Someone had been watering it. Graham met them at the gate. He led them into the hall. The Baron was sitting at the same table, but this time he wasn't alone. Standing next to him was a man Daniel hadn't seen before. A woman, tall, upright, in a dark dress, polished quartz glasses on her delicate face, her hair pulled back, her hands folded in front of her. Precise hands. The hands of someone who works with papers, not with the earth. The Baron introduced her, Yasmin Ravenwood, archivist of the provincial chancery. She had arrived from the capital on behalf of the royal court. Daniel looked at her. She was looking at him. Her eyes behind the lenses were dark and attentive, like camera lenses, recording everything. The Baron spoke. He said the figures had impressed him, that 42% was more than he had expected, that his treasury was fuller than it had been in the last 10 years, and that he was ready to admit it. The canals were working. But, the Baron paused. There's always a but. He said that the royal court had taken notice, that rumors had reached the capital about villages that had ceased to depend on the feudal lords, about the Guild of Watermasters, about a man who came out of nowhere and is reshaping the province. The king doesn't like this, not because it's bad, because it's uncontrollable. Yasmin Ravenwood had arrived to compile a report for the king, and this report would determine what happens next. Daniel turned to Yasmin. She began to speak. Her voice was even and formal, 6 forms of communication. She said she wanted to see everything: the canals, the catchment basins, the documentation, the records, the results, the mistakes, everything. She would stay in the province as long as necessary, and her report would be accurate. Daniel nodded. He said he would show her everything, without holding anything back, because he had nothing to hide. Water flows downhill. That's no secret. Yasmin raised an eyebrow slightly. The Baron leaned back in his chair. The audience was over. On the way back, Ella remained silent until evening. Then, when they stopped for the night by the roadside, she said that this woman was dangerous. Daniel asked why. Ella said it was because she had no face, only eyes. She looks but doesn't show what she sees. Daniel thought for a moment and said that was the description of a good engineer. Ella snorted and said that was the description of a good spy. Yasmin arrived in Sukhoi Broad 3 days after them, on horseback, alone, with 2 bags of papers. She spent 2 weeks in the village. She walked along the canals. She measured. She took notes. She asked questions. Of everyone. From Merrick to Nolan. From Ella to old woman Gwen. She asked questions Daniel hadn't expected. Not technical ones. Social ones. Who decides when to open the valve? Who distributes the water among the families? What happens if 2 people want to water their fields at the same time? Who settles disputes? How the guild is organized? Is there a charter? Is there a court? Are there penalties for breaking the rules? Daniel answered everything, honestly, including the fact that there were no bylaws yet, that Ella settled disputes because she was trusted, that there was only one penalty: disconnection from the canal for a day. After that, the offender usually reached an amicable agreement. Yasmin took notes. Her expression was inscrutable. On the third day, she asked Emily for access to the records. Emily looked at Daniel. He nodded. Yasmin read the records all night. In the morning, she returned them. She said one thing. She said that in 16 years of working in the archives, she had never seen anything like it. Not channels, not numbers. Documentation. A system for transferring knowledge. The Khan Daniel Protocol. Sora's blueprints. Instructions for craftsmen. This isn't a village construction project. It's an engineering school. Daniel didn't try to downplay it. He said that was exactly what had been intended. Yasmin looked at him over her glasses, and for the first time in 2 weeks, Daniel saw something other than professional detachment on her face. Interest. Genuine interest. On the 5th day, Yasmin asked Daniel to walk with her to the reservoir. Alone. Without witnesses. They stood at the edge. They looked out at the water. Yasmin took off her glasses and wiped them with a handkerchief. Without her glasses, her face looked different, younger, more vulnerable. She said she wanted to show him something. She took a rolled-up sheet of paper out of her bag. Old, yellowed. She unrolled it. A map. A very old one. It depicted the Ayrton Plain, all 7 domains, but no borders. Lines. Blue lines. Yasmin told him everything that night. They were sitting by the water collection basin. The moon was reflected in the dark water. Ella was asleep in the village. No one knew they were there. Yasmin spoke quietly, calmly, like someone who had rehearsed this conversation for years and had finally found the right person to say it to. 150 years ago, the Ayrton Empire was united. 7 domains under one crown. The imperial family ruled not by the sword, but by the weather. They had mages, weather mages, the most powerful on the continent. They controlled the hurricanes that swept in from the North Sea every spring. The hurricanes were devastating. They destroyed crops, they flooded villages, they ravaged cities. Thousands died every year. The imperial court decided to put a stop to it. They gathered the 12 most powerful weather mages. They performed a ritual, a massive one, in the center of the Imperial Valley. The ritual was meant to create a barrier, a wall of magical energy that would deflect the hurricanes away from the continent. The ritual worked. The hurricanes stopped. The people rejoiced. The empire celebrated. But 20 years later, strange things began to happen. Rainfall became less frequent. Rivers ran dry, first in the south, then in the west, then everywhere except one place, the Imperial Valley. The meteorologists realized what had happened. The barrier wasn't just deflecting the hurricanes, it was redirecting all the moisture. It was drawing it from the atmosphere across the entire continent and concentrating it at a single point, at the center of the ritual. The Imperial Valley became a garden. The rest of the continent began to die. The imperial family knew. The feudal lords knew. Those who were at court back then, their descendants still know to this day. The church found out 50 years later and has remained silent ever since. The people do not know. To the people, it is the drying of the sky, a test from the gods, patience and prayer. But in reality, it's a broken mechanism, a magical ritual that has been running for a century and a half and is slowly killing the continent. Daniel listened, silently. Every word sank into his head like a stone at the bottom of a well, heavy, hollow. He asked why they didn't destroy the ritual. Yasmin said they had tried, 3 times. The first time, 20 years after it was created. A group of weather mages tried to destroy the knot. The barrier wavered, and a hurricane that hadn't been seen in 20 years returned in a single day. The coastline was washed away. 4,000 people died. The ritual was restored. The second time, 70 years later, a secret order of sages found a way to gradually weaken the ritual. The Imperial Guard slaughtered them all, because weakening the ritual meant losing their monopoly on water, and a monopoly on water means power. The third time, 20 years ago, a lone mage. He made it to the node. He tried to reconfigure it. An explosion destroyed him and a section of the valley within a kilometer's radius. The ritual held. The mage became a stain on the ground. Yasmin fell silent. Daniel sat and stared at the water in the catchment basin. 200 cubic meters. His catchment basin, his work, his canals, his terraces. Everything he'd built over the course of a year. A drop in the bucket. On the scale of the problem Yasmin had just described, it was a drop in the bucket. He asked why she'd told him. Yasmin said it was because he was the only person on this continent who could solve it. Not a mage, not a warrior, not a politician. An engineer. Because the problem isn't magic. Magic is energy, like water. It flows. It has a gradient. It has a channel. A ritual is a system of channels, magical ones. It collects moisture and directs it to a single point. Destroying the channels means flooding everything. But what if we redesign them? What if we change the channels? What if we distribute the flow not to a single point, but to all 7 domains, evenly? Then the hurricanes will remain behind the barrier, and the moisture will spread across the entire continent. No flood, no drought. Balance. Daniel was silent for a long time. Then he said he'd never worked with magic. Yasmin replied that he'd worked with water. And water and magic in this world obey the same laws: flow, slope, pressure, distribution. She took a second sheet of paper out of her bag, a diagram of the ritual node, drawn by someone who had seen it from the inside. Daniel looked at the diagram, lines, circles, connection points, and slowly, very slowly, he began to see. It wasn't a magical symbol. It was an irrigation diagram, rough, primitive, with a single central collector and 12 supply channels. All the moisture flowed toward the center, just like in his catchment basin. Only this catchment basin was the size of a valley, and the channels weren't made of clay. They were made of magic. But the principle was the same, the very same principle. Daniel looked at Yasmin. She was looking at him, waiting. He said he needed to see the system with his own eyes. Yasmin nodded. She said she'd make it happen, but not right now. First, he had to finish what he'd started in the province. Because if the Baron or the King destroyed his work while he was in the Imperial Valley, there would be nowhere to return to. Daniel understood. He returned to the village at dawn. He lay down on the straw, he closed his eyes, and in his mind's eye, he saw the ritual diagram. 12 channels converging at a single point. And he began to mentally redraw them, to spread them out, to distribute them, not toward the center, but in a circle. Each channel to its own domain. Each domain receives its share, evenly. It was the greatest irrigation challenge of his life, and he was the only person on the planet who could solve it. In the morning, he didn't say anything to Ella. Not because he didn't trust her, because he didn't yet know what to say. He needed time. Time to think, time to calculate, time to design, and time to finish what he had started. Because Yasmin was right. The foundation must be solid before building the roof. For the next 6 months, Daniel worked on 2 fronts. By day, he built. By night, he designed. Sukhoi Broad became the center of the network. Not just a village, a hub. Roads led to it from 12 villages. People traveled along these roads. Craftsmen, apprentices, merchants, messengers. Bartos's caravan now stopped in Dryford for 3 days instead of 1. Not out of kindness, out of profit. There was grain here. There was water here. There were people here who had silver. The Watermasters Guild received its charter. Emily wrote it in 2 weeks. Daniel dictated the principles. Ella added the rules. Hana contributed the section on land. Sora wrote the section on mechanisms. The charter was 20 pages long. The main rule was the first. Water belongs to those who extracted it, not to the Lord, not to the church, not to the master, to the community that dug it up. The second rule, knowledge is free. Every master is obligated to teach anyone who wants to learn, free of charge, no strings attached. Third, a master receives a share of the first harvest in the village where he worked, 1/10, no more. That is his payment. Fourth, every project is documented, recorded, submitted to the guild's archive, which Emily managed. 32 masters signed the charter. There was no seal. Sora forged it, a bronze disc with a drop of water in the center, the guild's first official symbol. Madeline Ashford arrived in Dryford at the beginning of the second year, on horseback, with a sword at her belt, dressed in men's clothing, dusty, tanned, with a scratch running across her entire left cheek. She dismounted at the community hall and asked who was in charge here. Merrick pointed to Daniel. Madeline walked up to him. She looked down at him. She was half a head taller. She said she had come on her father's behalf, Sir Corvin Ashford, a knight from a neighboring domain, now impoverished. His lands were parched. He'd sent his daughter to see if it was true that they'd found a way to combat the drought in Caldric, or if it was just a rumor. Daniel said it wasn't a rumor. "Show me," Madeline said. "I'll show you," he replied. He showed her canals, water catchments, terraces, fields yielding a second harvest of the year, grain up to her waist, greenery, water in the canals, children playing by the fountain. The fountain. Small, simple, a stone basin from which water flowed through a pipe from the upper canal. It gurgled, quietly, constantly. Daniel had built it a month ago, on the spot where Lyra was buried, Ella's sister. Ella didn't ask. Daniel didn't ask. He just built it. When Ella saw it for the first time, she stood there listening to the water murmur for a long time. Then she left. That evening, Daniel found a small bouquet of wildflowers by the fountain, yellow ones. Ella didn't say anything, and Daniel didn't say anything. Words weren't necessary. Madeline watched it all for 2 days. On the third day, she went to Daniel and said she was staying. He asked why. She said her father had sent her to assess the threat. She had assessed it. There was no threat. There was an opportunity. But an opportunity needed protection, because barons and lords and knights won't stand idly by while peasants become independent. Daniel asked what she was proposing. Madeline said he needed a guard, a real one, not peasants with shovels, people who know how to handle weapons, who can stand between the builders and the swords. Daniel said he didn't want an army. Madeline replied that it wasn't an army. It was a guard, like the guards of a merchant caravan, only they'd be protecting the canals instead of goods. Daniel thought about it for a day. Then he agreed. He appointed Madeline head of security for the Watermasters Guild, an official position, the guild's seal on the document, a salary based on a share of the harvest. Madeline held the paper and stared at it. Daniel saw her fingers tremble slightly. She said that her whole life she'd been paid for who she was born to be, a knight's daughter, a commodity for the marriage market. For the first time, she was being paid for what she could do. Daniel said that was normal. That's how it should be. Madeline smiled wryly. She said he was strange for a man. He replied that he was an engineer, not a man. Madeline burst out laughing, for the first time in his presence, loudly, tilting her head back. Ella was standing around the corner and heard that laughter. Daniel noticed that Ella had been quieter than usual that evening. He walked over to her. He asked if everything was all right. Ella said yes. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were different. Daniel didn't press her for details. He understood. He wasn't blind. But now wasn't the time. Right now, it was all about the channels. Right now, it was about the people. Right now, it was about the Baron and the King and the ritual on the horizon. The rest could wait. Madeline had assembled a guard over the past month. 10 men, not knights, peasants who knew how to fight, farmers' sons who went hunting. One former soldier from the Baron's guard who'd left because he'd stopped receiving his pay. Madeline taught them formation and discipline, not to kill, to stand, to hold the line, to close ranks. That was enough. Meanwhile, Daniel worked on his main project at night, a diagram for redirecting magical currents. He didn't know magic, but he knew hydraulics. And the longer he looked at the ritual diagram, the clearer it became to him that it was one and the same thing. 12 channels converging at a single point. One. All 12. All the moisture. All the energy. Into the center. A stupid diagram. Any first-year engineering student would say it was a stupid diagram. A single central collector with no distribution is a guarantee of overload, a guarantee of losses, a guarantee of imbalance. A different architecture is needed, a ring configuration, with distribution nodes. Each channel goes not to the center, but to the nearest node. Each node distributes the flow in 3 directions. Each direction leads to the next node, and so on in a circle, evenly distributed, no center, no monopoly, no single point of failure. Daniel drew diagram after diagram, on birch bark, on parchment that Emily pulled from her stash, on flat stones, on the walls of the shed. Ella walked in one night and saw him by the light of an oil lamp. He was sitting on the floor amid dozens of drawings, lines, circles, arrows, numbers. She asked what it was. He said it was a project. She asked what kind. He paused. Then he said he'd tell her, when he was ready. Ella looked at the drawings. Yasmin sent a reply 10 days later. Not a note, a person. An old man, small, thin, dressed simply, with a white wooden staff. His eyes faded to transparency. He came on foot, alone, without any luggage. He called himself Orden. He said that Yasmin had sent him and that he was one of those seeking a way to repair the sky. Daniel looked at him. He asked which order he belonged to. Orden smiled wryly and said it was one that had officially ceased to exist 80 years ago. They sat by the water collection basin. Orden looked at the water, then at the canals, then at the terraces, then back at the water. He said he could see, that he understood, that what Daniel was doing with water was what they had tried to do with magic. Only Daniel was succeeding, because he wasn't afraid of simple solutions. Mages are always looking for complicated ones. Daniel unfolded his diagram. 7 nodes, 12 rerouted channels, a looped connection. Orden looked at it for a long time. His fingers traced the lines. His lips moved. He was counting. Then he looked up. He said it might work, that no one had ever thought of a ring configuration before. Everyone had focused on how to destroy the center, or how to weaken the flows. No one had thought to simply redirect them, like water in a canal. But there's a problem. To reconfigure the ritual, you have to be inside the node, and the node is guarded by the Imperial Guard. 3 rings, mages, knights, walls. A person can't just walk in there. Daniel asked how many mages were needed for the restructuring. Orden said 7, 1 for each node. Each mage at their own node, simultaneously, in sync. One inaccurate gesture and the balance will shift. The hurricane will return, or worse. Daniel asked if there were 7. Orden paused. Then he said there were 5. From the old order. Old men. 2 were missing. Daniel thought for a moment. Then he asked if an ordinary person could stand at a node and do what was needed if they were taught. Orden looked at him in surprise, then with something resembling respect. He said that, theoretically, yes. The magic of the ritual isn't a gift. It's a mechanism, like a water pump. You turn the handle, water flows. You don't need to be a mage to turn the handle. You just need to know which way and when. Daniel nodded. He said he'd be the 6th. Orden asked, and the 7th? Daniel said he'd find him. Orden left the next day, quietly, just as he'd arrived. Daniel stood by the road and watched him go. Then he turned and saw Ella. She was standing behind him, her arms crossed. Her face was stony. She said she'd heard everything, that she'd been standing behind the water collection tank, that she was tired of waiting for him to tell her. Daniel was silent. Ella said that if he thought he was going alone, he was wrong, that she would be the 7th. Daniel started to say that it was dangerous. Ella cut him off. She said that 2 years ago, it was dangerous just to be alive. Every day, every minute. It was dangerous to wake up in the morning and not know if there would be water by evening. It was dangerous to watch the children wither away. It was dangerous to bury her sister. She said that after all that, standing at the magic node and turning the handle didn't seem particularly scary to her. Daniel looked at her, at the woman who, in 2 years, had transformed from the village headman's desperate daughter into the leader of 12 villages, into a forewoman, into a coordinator, into a person trusted by hundreds of people. He nodded. Ella would be the 7th. The preparations took 3 months. Daniel handed over control of Dry Ford to Hannah and Emily. Hannah knew the land. Emily knew the system. Together, they could keep everything running. Madeline and her guards ensured security. Sora worked in the blacksmith shop and trained 2 new apprentices. Master Pak stood nearby and nodded silently as his daughter explained something. He had long since stopped arguing. Tobias took command of all the masters in the province, 32 people in 12 villages. He knew every canal, every catchment, every valve. Daniel had called him over before leaving. They stood on the upper terrace. Daniel said that if he didn't return, Tobias knew what to do. Tobias nodded. Then he said that Daniel would return, because if he didn't, Tobias would have to calculate the gradients himself, and he hated doing math. Daniel smiled. They shook hands. The journey to the Imperial Valley took 3 weeks. Daniel and Ella traveled with a trade caravan. Barthos, his caravan. Barthos didn't ask where they were going or why. He said that if Daniel needed to go northeast, the caravan was heading northeast. A coincidence. Daniel didn't argue. Yasmin met them at the border of the Imperial domain, alone, in traveling clothes. No glasses, no papers. She was different. Not an archivist. A person. Frightened and determined at the same time. She led them along secret paths past the outer security ring, through a mountain pass, at night, in the dark, along a path known only to shepherds. On the 3rd day, they saw the valley. Daniel stopped. Ella stopped beside him. The valley lay below like a bowl, green, bright green. After a year in Dry Ford and the parched province of Caldric, this greenery was a sight to behold. Rivers flowed, full-flowing, wide. The fields were heavy with harvest. The forests glistened with moisture. Clouds hung over the valley, low, wet, ready to pour down rain. And all around, beyond the valley's borders, dust, dry earth, dry riverbeds. The contrast was so stark it seemed painted. Ella looked on and said nothing. Then she whispered that this was where their rain had gone. Daniel nodded. That's where. They descended into the valley at night. Orden was waiting for them at an abandoned shepherd's hut. 4 others were with him, old men, quiet, with faces carved from wood, the last mages of the old order. Orden unfolded a map. The ritual site stood in the center of the valley, a stone ring 200 meters in diameter, 12 pillars, each 3 times a man's height. Lines on the ground between the pillars burned into the stone, magical channels. They glowed at night, dimly, blue. A guard, an inner ring, 12 knights, 3 mages. They rotated every 6 hours. Daniel listened and sketched a plan, not an assault, a diversion. He didn't need to defeat the guards. He needed them to be away for an hour. 1 hour. In an hour, 7 people at 7 key points could redirect the currents, if they worked in sync, if they didn't make a mistake. Ella asked how to distract the 12 knights and 3 mages. Daniel looked at Yasmin. Yasmin pulled a piece of paper out of her bag, with a seal, the Imperial seal. She said she had a forged order to evacuate the node, signed in the name of the garrison commander, convincing enough for the guards to obey it and move to their positions at the northern gates. For an hour, maybe 2, until they realize the order is fake. Daniel looked at her. He asked what would happen to her when the deception was uncovered. Yasmin put on her glasses. Her face became inscrutable again. She said it wasn't his concern. Daniel disagreed. He said it was his concern, because she was the first person in this world he trusted as much as himself. Yasmin froze. Behind her glasses, her eyes flashed. She quickly looked away. She said they needed to get ready. There wasn't much time. They entered the ritual chamber an hour before dawn. Yasmin had delivered the evacuation order 2 hours earlier. The guards had left. Not all of them. 1 knight remained by the eastern pillar. He had fallen asleep. Orden slipped past him, as silently as a shadow, and touched his temple with his fingers. The knight went limp and slid down the stone. Sleep, not death. Daniel stepped across the line on the ground and felt it. Not with his skin, not with his eyes, with something inside. A hum. Low. Constant. As if the ground beneath his feet were vibrating. The magical channels. They were working. 150 years without stopping, pumping the moisture of the entire continent into this spot. Daniel stood in the center and looked around. 12 pillars. 12 lines on the stone. They glowed. A faint blue light, like water in the moonlight. He took out his diagram, unfolded it. He looked at the pillars. He looked at the lines. And he saw it. Everything he'd calculated on paper was right there, in the stone, in the magic. 12 channels converging at a single point, the central collector. Overloaded, rough, as if someone had built an irrigation system for a single field and forced it to water an entire continent. No wonder it had broken down. It had been miscalculated from the very beginning. Orden stood beside him. He said the clock was ticking. An hour, maybe less. Daniel nodded. Everyone took their positions. 5 old men at 5 pillars. Daniel at the 6th. Ella at the 7th. The remaining 5 pillars stood empty. They didn't need operators. Orden had explained the day before. 7 key points, 5 secondary ones. The secondary ones would realign automatically when the key ones changed, like the tributaries of a river. When you change the course of the main river, the tributaries find their own new path. Daniel stood by his pillar. The stone beneath his hands was warm, alive. The lines on the floor pulsed. He could feel the flow. He didn't see it. He felt it. Just as when you stand by a canal, you can feel the movement of the water without even looking at it, through the vibration of the earth, through the sound, through the scent of moisture. It was the same thing, only on a different scale. He looked at Ella. She was standing by her pillar, 30 meters away from him, upright, pale. her hands on the stone. She was looking at him. He nodded. She nodded back. Orden raised his hand. Let's begin. Daniel placed both palms on the pillar and closed his eyes. Orden had been teaching him for 3 days what to do, how to direct it, not with magic, with intention. The magic of the ritual was like water in a canal. It flowed along a laid-out channel. To change the channel, he had to create a new one, not with force, with form. Imagine it, see it with your inner eye, and the flow would follow it, because water always seeks a path. Daniel closed his eyes and saw, not darkness, a pattern, his own pattern, 12 lines, 7 nodes, a ring. He saw the flow moving along the old channel, toward the center, powerful, dense, like a river in flood. And he began to redirect it, slowly, like opening a gate, just a little. The flow wavered, swayed. Daniel felt resistance. For 150 years, this channel had flowed in one direction, inertia, like an old riverbed. The stones were polished, the bottom was compacted. The current knew this path. It didn't want another. Daniel applied pressure, not with force, with precision. He envisioned a new channel, clear, even, with the correct slope, 1.5%, as always. The current sensed the new path. It slowed down, it tested the waters, and began to diverge. Part of it flowed along the new channel. Part of it remained in the old one. Daniel could hear the others working nearby. Orden, the 4 old men, Ella, each at their own pillar, each redirecting their own stream, in sync, like a crew opening valves simultaneously. The rumble beneath his feet changed. It grew louder, higher pitched. The lines on the floor began to change color, from blue to green. The streams diverged, one after another. The 12 channels stopped converging at the center and began to fan out toward the 7 nodes. The ring was closing. Daniel could feel it, like you feel when a catch basin fills up and the water reaches the overflow. Fullness, completion, balance. Then everything began to shake. The ground jolted. Daniel opened his eyes. The pillars were vibrating. The lines on the ground were flashing. Green, blue, green, white. The old channel was resisting. 150 years of inertia wouldn't give in so easily. The central collector was pulling the streams back, toward itself, like a whirlpool. Orden shouted that they had to hold on, that just one more minute, that the streams had almost realigned. Daniel clenched the stone of the pillar. His hands were burning, not from magic, from the effort. He held the image of the new channel before his inner eye. Clear, even, correct. A 1.5% slope, clay walls, a compacted bottom. He saw it as clearly as he had seen his first canal in Sukhoi Brod. 420 meters from the hill to the village, 0.5 meter wide, 0.5 meter deep. Water flows downhill, always, everywhere. Water flows downhill. The ground stopped shaking. The rumble changed. It became steady, deep, calm. The lines on the floor glowed green, all 12 of them, a steady, unflinching light. The streams rearranged themselves. Daniel took his hands off the pillar. He took a step back. He looked around. 5 old men stood by their pillars, alive, exhausted, but alive. Orden sat on the ground, breathing heavily. His face was gray, but he was smiling. Ella stood by her pillar, leaning on the stone with both hands. Her knees were trembling. She looked at Daniel across the 30-meter stone ring, and he saw on her face what he had seen on the faces of the people at the first well, at the first canal, at the first harvest. The realization that they had succeeded. Orden stood up. He walked over to Daniel. He said they had to leave. that the guards would be back in a matter of minutes. They left through the same pass, quickly, in the pre-dawn twilight. Behind them, over the valley, something began to happen that hadn't been seen in 150 years. The clouds were moving. They weren't hovering over the valley as if glued in place. They were moving, drifting apart, slowly. Like water from a catchment basin when you open all the valves at once, to the west, south, east, in all directions. The clouds carried moisture, the moisture the valley had been storing for a century and a half. Daniel stopped at the pass and turned around. Ella stood beside him. Yasmin stood a little farther away. They watched as the clouds dispersed across the sky, as the horizon, once white and empty, turned gray and heavy. Somewhere far to the south, on the outskirts of Caldret Province, the sky had darkened. Rain. Not just a downpour, not two in a season, real rain. The kind that would fall for days, weeks, the kind that would fill the riverbeds, the kind that would raise the water table, the kind that would quench the earth that had been parched for 150 years. Ella watched it all and said nothing. Then she said quietly that Lyra would have seen it. Daniel nodded. Yes, Lyra would have seen it. They descended from the pass and walked for 3 days to Bartos's caravan, which was waiting for them at the agreed-upon spot. Bartos looked up at the sky, at the clouds drifting in all directions. Then he looked at Daniel. Daniel shrugged. Bartos shook his head and said he didn't want to know. The journey back took 2 weeks. Along the way, they watched the sky change. Every day, a little more cloud cover. Every day, the air a little more humid. On the 7th day, it began to rain. Light, drizzling, but steady. Ella turned her face toward the rain and closed her eyes. Daniel rode beside her and watched her. The raindrops on her face, on her hands. Water from the sky, free, belonging to no one, for everyone. On the 11th day, they passed a village Daniel didn't recognize. Small, poor, just like Sukhoi Broad 2 years ago. Children stood by the road and watched the rain. Real rain, which had been falling for the 3rd day in a row, and showed no sign of stopping. A little girl, about 7 years old, stood barefoot in a puddle and laughed. She was just standing there, laughing, because there was so much water that she could stand in it up to her ankles, and it didn't end. Daniel stopped the donkey. He looked at the girl. Then he rode on. Ella rode beside him, silently. She saw the same thing he did. They returned to Sukhoi Broad on the 14th day. The village greeted them with rain. The canals were full. The catch basins were overflowing. Tobias stood by the community center, soaked to the skin, and laughed. Hana ran through the fields, checking the drainage. Sora was repairing the drainage ditch by the blacksmith shop because there was too much water and it was seeping under the wall. Master Pak helped her in silence. Emily stood on the porch of the community hall and took notes. The water level in the canals, the amount of rainfall, the condition of the fields. She didn't stop writing even when she saw Daniel. She just nodded and kept writing. Madeline stood at the village gate, with a sword, wet. She said that while they were away, 2 of the Baron's men had come to take a look. They saw the rain. They saw the canals. They left in silence. Madeline said their faces had the look of people who didn't understand what was happening. Daniel walked through the village, to the upper terrace. He stood at the edge. He looked down. Dry ford. 12 canals radiated out from the village like silver ribbons toward 12 neighboring settlements. Each canal carried water. Each settlement was alive. And above it all, rain fell from the sky. Steady, calm, real. Ella stood beside him, as always, silently. Then she turned to him. She looked at him. Daniel looked at her, at the rain on her face, at her wet hair, at her eyes, which no longer held any fatigue, pain, or fear. There was the calm strength of a person who had walked through the dust and emerged at the water's edge. She said quietly that now it was possible. Daniel asked what was possible. Ella didn't answer. She took his hand, wet, dirty, the hand of an engineer. They stood on the upper terrace in the rain, looking out at the world they had changed. Not with a sword, not with magic, not with power. With a shovel, a ditch, a 1.5% slope, and a stubborn belief that water always flows downhill. You just have to show it where to go. The rain was falling. The canals carried the water. The fields were turning green. Children were laughing down in the village. Somewhere far to the south, in glints, Tobias stood in the rain, tilting his head back to catch the raindrops in his mouth. Somewhere to the west, in Hamwick, Chris and Owen were turning the valves wide open because there was so much water that there was no need to conserve it. Somewhere to the east, in Oaklog, Grant was silently widening the canal because the old one couldn't handle the flow. Somewhere in Redfall, Father Lucas stood by his holy spring and prayed. This time, his prayer was one of gratitude, genuine gratitude. And somewhere in the provincial capital, Yasmin Ravenwood sat at a desk in the archives and wrote a report. Not for the king, for history. A report on how one engineer with a shovel changed the continent. She wrote and smiled, for the first time in many years. Because for the first time in many years, she had something to write about. Daniel stood on the terrace and listened to the rain. He wasn't thinking about the past. He wasn't thinking about Oregon. He wasn't thinking about the truck on the highway near Ashgabat. He was thinking about tomorrow. About the new canals that needed to be dug now that there was enough water. About the new villages. About the new craftsmen. About how Sora had shown him a blueprint yesterday for a new type of wind-powered water lift. About how Emily had started writing a textbook. A real one, not just notes. A textbook on hydraulic engineering for a world that had just learned that water flows downhill. Ella stood beside him. She held his hand. It was raining. The world was changing. Slowly. Drop by drop, furrow by furrow, sprout by sprout. Just as it should.